Okay, Michelle, we're live and we're ready to go.
Thank you. I call this May 31st, 2022 meeting of the Subdivision and Development Appeal Board to order. My name is Michelle Coos. I will be chair of today's hearing. All questions and comments shall be directed through me, the chair. The board members for today's meeting are myself, Jim Bell, and Harry Scott. I would ask Jim to identify himself.
Hello.
And Harry.
Harry Scott, public board member.
Thank you both. The clerk for today is Katie Bravo Stewart. I would ask Ms. Bravo Stewart to identify herself.
Hello, I'm Katie Bravo Stewart, and I am the SDB clerk for today's hearing.
Thank you. Before introducing the appeal, I would like for each member of the town's administration to identify themselves.
Hello, everybody. My name is Riley Weldon, and I'm the development planner for the town of Kenmore, and I was the file manager for this application.
Thank you, Mr. Weldon.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Lauren Miller. I'm the manager of planning and development with the town of Kenmore, and it is our department's responsibility to review and issue development permits.
Thank you, Ms. Miller.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the board. My name is Brian Kinsey. I'm a community development engineer with the town of Kenmore. Although I haven't been personally involved in this file, I am attending today on behalf of Ms. Claire Ellick, who is our transportation engineer, and have been fully briefed on the contents of the application and the appeal.
Thank you, Mr. Kinsey. Are there other members of town administration attending today?
Yeah, I'm Jolene Noel, and I'm the meeting administrator for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Noel. The first item on our agenda for today is adoption of the agenda. And ask the board and Ms. Bravo Stewart if there are any additions, deletions, or changes to the agenda as provided.
There is no changes, Madam Chair.
Thank you. There being none, I motion for the board to adopt the agenda as circulated. Those in favor? Those opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. The next item on the agenda for today is adoption of the minutes from prior meetings. Are there any additions, deletions, or changes to the minutes of the appeal hearing dated April 21st, 2022? Ms. Bravo Stewart?
Oh, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I have one small one on the last page under postponement. Acting chair should be vice chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Are there any other changes?
The only other recommended changes are that in the last paragraph in the discussion, it refers to an adjournment of the SDAB hearing on April 21st, but it should actually read postponement. So if the board is comfortable with me updating and replacing adjourned with postponement, I'll make those changes as well as adding vice chair.
That's acceptable to me. We'd ask you to make those changes. I move the board to approve the minutes of the April 21st, 2022 hearing as amended. Those in favor? Those opposed? Motion unanimously carried. The next minutes are the minutes for the May 6, 2022 hearing. Are there any requested additions, deletions, or changes to those minutes? Mr. Bell?
One small change on the second page under comments clarification by the appellant. The last word board should be uppercase.
Any other requests?
There are none for me, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I move the board to approve the minutes of the May 6, 2022 appeal hearing as amended. Those in favor? Those opposed? Motion unanimously carried. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is today's postponed appeal, number PL 2021-0423. First item is for the appellant to identify and introduce themselves. I would ask the appellant and his or her representative to identify themselves.
Yes, I'm Sean Hennessy. I'm the spokesperson for the appellant group.
Mr. Hennessy, will you have an agent representing you today, or will you be representing the group on your own?
I'll be representing the group on my own.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy. Do you have any objection to the board members hearing this appeal?
No, I don't.
Thank you. And have you received a copy of the agenda package distributed to the board? And do you have any objections with the information contained therein?
Yes, I received it. I have no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy. I would now ask the applicant and the applicant's agent to identify themselves, please.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, board members. My name is Dale Hildebrand for the applicant.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Hildebrand. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Kathleen O'Hatton Lake, Shores Jardine LLP. I'm here as legal counsel for the applicant.
Thank you both. Does the applicant have any objection to the board members present hearing the appeal today?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And have you received a copy of the agenda package that was distributed to the board? And do you have any objections to the information contained in it?
We have received it and we have no objections. Thank you.
Thank you. As we've been through this before, I'll attempt to be brief, but I want to summarize for everyone's benefit today the hearing process. The hearing process for today will be as follows. Administration will make a summary presentation for the board with an opportunity of the board members for questions. The appellant, Mr. Hennessy, will then have an opportunity to present to the board. There will be an opportunity for questions to Mr. Hennessy. Then there will be an opportunity for any others who are in favor of the appeal to present to the board or speak, and questions of the board for those people. The applicant then, either Mr. Hildebrand or his agent, Ms. O'Hatton Lake, will have an opportunity to make a presentation to the board, followed by questions. If there are any persons present in opposition of the appeal, they will then have an opportunity to speak and make a presentation to the board, followed by questions. Finally, we will have an opportunity to hear from any persons that are speaking neither in favor nor opposition of the appeal, and we'll have an opportunity for the board members to ask those persons questions. If necessary, the board may then ask for a short recess, following which we will allow the appellant to provide clarification or closing remarks. Then the applicant may have an opportunity to provide clarification or closing remarks, and then we'll ask the town staff whether or not they have any clarification points or closing remarks. I'd like to remind everybody that the purpose of today's hearing is for the appellant and the affected parties to provide the board with information for the appeal. The board must base its decision on planning merits. As outlined, affected persons will be given an opportunity to speak. I would ask that if you are identified as a person with an opportunity to speak later in the process, that you do wait your opportunity to speak then. And also, if you have any follow-up points, we would ask that you refrain from making those points until you have an opportunity for any clarification or closing points towards the end of the hearing. All speakers must ensure that all comments are directed to the board. Also, that all comments be of proper decorum and be succinct. If another person has made the point, please simply refer to that point and say that you agree with the earlier comment. If any person is presenting today has written documents, including a map or photographs or report, we ask that a copy of those documents be provided with Ms. Bravo Stewart, the clerk for today. And once the board closes the public portion of today's hearing, the board will go into an in-camera or private meeting to review the information provided. The board will then provide a written decision within 15 days of the hearing. Does the appellant have any concerns with the process outlined today?
No, I don't.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy. Mr. Hildebrand, do you have any concerns with the process outlined here today?
No, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you all. To get started, I would ask that the development officer make their presentation. Thank you, Mr. Weldon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the board. I'm going to start by maybe asking for some patience with me today. I am feeling a little under the weather, unfortunately, and so I may need to take the odd break if that's okay.
But we understand, and if you need a short recess, just let us know and we can give you a short break as well.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. Okay, so Madam Chair and members of the board, I'd like to first start with the information that was provided at the last hearing and was the subject to the adjournment until today. So at the last meeting, the new information was submitted to the board, which resulted in the board adjourning the meeting to allow administration, but other parties and also the board the opportunity to review the information that had been submitted at that day. So administration has reviewed the new information submitted to the SDAB. And we have determined that a new application is required to be submitted and processed to determine if the changes proposed are consistent with the land use bylaw and is appropriate for the site. So the reason for this determination is that the new information proposes a significant change to the scale and configuration of the common amenity housing and townhouse uses on the proposed site, which inherently changes what was originally approved by the Development Authority, which was the Kenmore Planning Commission. As a result, and because of this, administration has determined that a new development permit application is required to adequately assess and make the determination and recommendation on this new information and the proposed change. So with that being said, the SDAB has accepted this new information. And with this, the board does have the following options, which are the same options that are available to the board with the original proposal. That is that the board can confirm, revoke, or vary the order, decision, or development permit, or any condition attached to any of them, or make or substitute an order, decision, or permit of its own. Or the board may make an order or decision or issue or confirm the issue of a development permit, even though the proposed development does not comply with the land use bylaw. I will pause there now, and I'm happy to take any questions the board may have before I move forward with my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Weldon. I'll ask, I believe we should probably make a determination on a preliminary point based on your request as to whether or not the board would like to proceed with the full appeal today, given that it does have the powers to make an order on substantive grounds. Before going in camera to make a determination on that point, I would like to hear from both the appellant and the applicant with respect to that particular issue that you raised. Mr. Scott, Mr. Bell, do you have any concerns with that procedure? Would you be in support of going in camera to determine that point?
Chair, I have one question that I'd like to pose to Mr. Weldon.
Certainly.
I'd like to know if, is there anything that would prevent the board from considering the decision of the CPC that's actually in front of us and the appeal in front of us?
Sure. Through the chair to Mr. Bell, thank you for the question. That's a very good question. my understanding is no, Mr. Bell, that there is nothing that would prevent you from still considering the, let's say, the original, let's call it, decision by the Kenmore Planning Commission on this application.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Scott, any questions, comments?
No, I have no questions, but I think I would like to hear from both the appellant and the applicant.
Certainly.
For their feelings, and then I agree, we should go into in-camera to discuss it.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I'd like to call on Mr. Hennessy for his remarks. Mr. Hennessy?
I guess just a clarification, if the board goes in camera, will it be considering the original development application or the compromise that was reached between the appellant and the applicant? Or is it both are going to be considered by the board in camera?
Mr. Hennessy, the board would likely review two issues. One, whether or not to proceed with the appeal today, and if so, make a determination on the appeal of the original development permit, and then consideration of the amendment, because that information is in front of us and we do have the authority to consider it and any proposed conditions. So I expect that we would assess all three issues should we go in camera.
Point of order, Michelle, I just had a quick comment.
Please proceed, Ms. Bravo Stewart.
So just for clarification, the subject appeal is still, it can still be based on that original application that went before CPC. The board accepted the new information, which was presented by the appellant and the applicant. And it's to the board to decide when they're weighing their decision, if they're going to use that new information with the subject application that's before you. But there's no issue with you going back and reviewing this as based on that original application that went before CPC. Just because new information was submitted does not mean that that's going to hinder the original information that was before the board.
Thank you, Ms. Bravo Stewart. That was my understanding as well. I appreciate your confirmation of that interpretation. Mr. Hennessy, any further comments?
So it's based on what's been said, it'd be my understanding then that the board would come back in camera and either proceed with the original appeal or come back and say we accept the compromise. Is that correct? Am my understanding correct on that?
The board has the authority to consider the original appeal and to either uphold it, deny it, or change it, and also to come to its own decision, so provide a substitute order. So all of those options are within our authority and certainly would be considered if we were to go in camera.
Okay, thank you for that.
Any questions for Mr. Hennessy, Mr. Scott, or Mr. Bell? Thank you. I would now ask to hear from Mr. Hildebrand or his agent, Ms. Elkwood Lake. Forgive me if I've mispronounced that.
Elhatton Lake, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
I'll make a comment on that. So just to be clear, what I understand the board to be going in camera to decide as a preliminary issue is if you're considering the original or the compromise position suggested, that's the preliminary issue the board's going in camera to decide, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so my submissions on that would be, so the Mr. Hildebrand had provided and notified the appellants that given the town's position that a new development permit application would be required, the applicant would be withdrawing from that compromise position. It's certainly still open to the board to consider it, but the applicant's position in this appeal today is that the board should confirm the development permit as granted by CPC. If the board considers there to be any merits to the appellant's concerns, certainly the board can vary and consider the compromise position as has been suggested. But the primary position of the applicant in today's proceeding is to ask the board to confirm the development permit as granted by CPC, given the town's position.
So to clarify, Ms. Elhatton Lake, the applicant would like to proceed with the original Schedule A and the original development permit, and withdraw the information, the amended Schedule A, if it's going to hinder our process today.
I don't know if I would say withdraw. Certainly, it's still on the agenda package for you to consider. The primary position would be asking the board to confirm the development permit as granted. But if the board finds there to be any merits to any of the appellant's concerns, certainly it can consider a variance in the form which was presented in that compromise position.
Thank you. Mr. Bell, Mr. Scott, any questions or comments from Ms. Elhatton Lake? Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I may just add on a little bit that may be helpful for your determinations. On May 16th, the development officer of the town of Canmore advised us that the town positions would be that a new development permit application would be made, would be required in order to consider the proposed design compromise, which was the subject of our joint appellant application letter of April 20th. So restarting the development permit process is not acceptable to us. We advised the appellant on the same day, May 16th, that we could no longer support the compromise position as the primary consideration for the board to consider in this hearing. So therefore, the appellants have been aware of our changed position for approximately 15 days. So notwithstanding the April 20th letter, we are asking the SDAB to confirm the development permit as approved by the CPC on February 25th, 2022. And as Kathleen has said, if you do confirm the CPC approved DP, then the April 20th letter becomes irrelevant. However, should you share the concerns of the appellant that the 6 common amenity housing units is too much for the neighborhood, then we respectfully request that you consider the approval of the compromise as you have the authority to do under the MGA. So I hope that makes it clear on what has transpired and what our position is. Thank you.
Thank you for the additional information, Mr. Hildebrand. I think we have sufficient information to go in camera and make a determination. I move the board to go in camera. Those in favor? Thank you. There being none opposed, the motion is unanimously carried. We will go in camera and come back following our determination.
Perfect. I've put down that we're going in camera at 1:23. Just give me one moment. All right, Madam Chair, we are back in the main session now.
Thank you, Ms. Bravo Stewart. I move the board to return to the public meeting. Those in favor? None opposed. Motion unanimously carried. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I'd like to let you know that the board is prepared to proceed with the appeal today of the original development permit application and the appeal of the decision of the CPC. To that end, I would ask that the development officer make a presentation with respect to the original application of the applicant and the decision of the CPC.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Just give me 1 second and I will have my presentation up on the screen here in a second.
Thank you, Mr. Weldon.
Okay, please let me know when you can see my screen and if everything's going okay here.
We can see Riley and it looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katie.
You're welcome.
Okay, good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the board. I would like to present to you development permit application PL 2021-0423 for your consideration this afternoon. So I will start just with some context, some site context in terms of its location. So the subject site consists of 3 parcels located at 1330 to 1342 First Avenue, and this is located in the TP Town neighborhood. On your screen, you can see an aerial photo of the site, and that's relative to the context of the neighborhood. The photo is looking to the southwest from above the Trans-Canada Highway. For orientation, Bow Valley Trail is at the top of the map, as you can see, and hopefully you can maybe see my cursor here. So Bow Valley Trail is here, 13th Street is here, First Avenue is here, the subject site is outlined in red here, the 3 parcels. Hospital Place is here, and then the Trans-Canada Highway is located here. Similarly, this is another aerial view, just a little bit zoomed in and from a different orientation. This is actually now looking directly north, and as if the camera is above Bow Valley Trail. The site again is outlined in red. The surrounding existing developments are, as you can see here, detached dwellings currently. That's to the north and to the south. Across the street, First Avenue consists of 3 plexes. This is the rear lane to the subject property, and currently there are detached dwellings across the rear lane as well. This is a street view photo of the subject property. This is as if you were standing on the corner of First Avenue and 13th Street, looking north down First Avenue. So the proposed development is for 13 townhouse units and 6 common amenity housing units, consisting of a total of 19 residential units for the site. Those units are configured as follows: 1 4-unit townhouse building and 1 5-unit townhouse building fronting onto First Avenue, 2 2-unit townhouses and 3-unit common amenity housing fronting onto the rear lane in the rear of the property. On your screen is a rendering of the townhouse units. This is looking east from First Avenue, which is the front of the site. This shows the 4-unit townhouse on the left of your screen and the 5-unit townhouse on the right. The land use district is TP Town Comprehensive Redevelopment District, and specifically it is Subdistrict A. Townhouse is a permitted use, while common amenity housing is a discretionary use in the land use district. This is a rendering of the building from the rear of the property. From the site is looking northwest. This shows 2 townhouse units and 3 common amenity housing on either side of the central stairwell in the middle of the structure. So this is the middle stairwell. This is the location of the common amenity housing areas on either side, and the townhouse units on either side of those. The image also shows a canopy extending out from the central part of the building here. And this is to provide cover for the bicycle parking area as well as the walkway from the rear lane. This is the site plan showing the layout of the townhouses and the common amenity housing. Each common amenity housing unit contains 5 bedrooms. The land use bylaw parking requirements are a minimum of 1 stall and a maximum of 2 stalls for each of the townhouse units. And parking for the common amenity housing was determined through a parking study. A minimum of 26 vehicle stalls are required and have been provided on site. Each townhouse unit provides a parking stall in an attached garage, and there are 12 surface stalls that have also been provided at the rear of the property for the common amenity housing. 1 loading visitor stall is also provided within the surface parking area. As mentioned previously, the common amenity housing parking was determined through a parking study. In accordance with this study, 12 vehicle parking stalls and a total of 68 bicycle parking stalls are provided on site. The parking stalls are located, the automobile parking stalls are located at the rear of the site, adjacent the rear lane. The bicycle parking includes 46 exterior or outside bicycle parking stalls and 20 stalls located within bike lockers. All 46 of the stalls are located on these are the exterior, are located on the ground level. And the 20 storage lockers located above grade next to each common amenity housing unit. A total of 48 exterior bicycle parking stalls have been provided on site, 2 of which are also provided for the townhouse units. The application proposes a form of contemporary style of architecture. This does include a 312 roof pitch. Contemporary architecture is supported in this district, and a less steep roof pitch is acceptable, provided access to light and privacy of neighboring properties is not unduly impacted. The site is designed with buildings located at the front and rear of the property with an outdoor amenity open central space in the middle. The central open space reduces the overall massing impact of the development and allows for more access to natural light when compared to a standard townhouse development that could extend across the length of the property. Planning is satisfied that this regulation is met and the access to light and privacy of the neighboring properties is not unduly impacted. The application does require 4 variances, each of which I will cover now. The first is a proposed variance to the maximum density provision of the district. The maximum density is 66 units per hectare. This equals 16 units given the total site area of the site. The proposed density is 77.8 units per hectare, which equals 19 units. The variance, therefore, is the addition of 3 units over the maximum number of units, which is 16. The provision of community common amenity housing provides an overarching community benefit by adding to Kenmore's affordable housing, affordable market housing supply, and potentially increasing the provision of housing for those working within the community. Providing affordable market housing and common amenity housing is supported by the town's municipal development plan and the TP Town Area Redevelopment Plan, which I'll provide more details on a bit later. 66 units per hectare is established to accommodate a low to medium density for this area of TP Town, and this is consistent with the purpose of the area redevelopment plan as well as the land use district. As a comparison for comparison purposes, the town has an R4, a residential medium density district, which provides a range between 48 units and 98 units per hectare. The variance is for 3 additional units for this area. These additional units are provided in the rear of the site, adjacent to the medium density residential area of TP Town, as shown on the concept plan of the area redevelopment plan, which is currently on your screen. So for context, the subject parcels is located here, which is in the low to medium density area. It is directly adjacent across the rear lane to the medium density area. The site is designed in a manner that provides a transition of units, with less units in the front of the site, which is adjacent to First Avenue, and more units in the rear of the site, including the common amenity housing units, which is transitioning to the medium density district of the TP Town. For these reasons, planning is supportive of this variance. The second variance is to the maximum eave line height. The eave line height is shown at 8.14 meters as opposed to the 7.5 meters required by the land use bylaw. This is shown on your screen by the red line. This is a 0.64 meters, or just over 2 feet, of the maximum eave line height. The overall building height is within the maximum 10-meter height allowed within the district. So the height of the building is within the regulations. And it is the eave line height that is slightly higher than what is currently allowed. Given the height requirement is met, the eave line height relates to roof form and the degree of the roof pitch that is being proposed. In this case, a 312 roof pitch is being proposed. This is allowed given the proposed contemporary architecture of the building. So the variance relates to the 0.64 meters difference of the eave line height between the 7.5 and the 8.14 meters. Eave line height relates to the massing impact of the building, as well as access to light and views of the neighboring properties. The side of the building includes a central open space, which I mentioned earlier, that allows light to the adjacent properties. The building frontage includes a high degree of articulation. This is also shown on your screen, including step back of the building of the different units from each other, balconies, framed windows, and a differentiation of materials and colors, which breaks up the perceived mass of the building when viewed from the front. Overall, administration is supportive of this variance as well. The third variance is to the regulation that requires the portion of the front and rear building facades above the eave line to be stepped back 1 meter. No step back is being proposed, and therefore a variance is required for this regulation. This requirement is intended to limit the building mass at the top of the building and promote a more pedestrian-oriented streetscape when viewed from the front and rear of the property. Portions of each building's front and rear facades are stepped back by 0.6 meters. This spans the length of the building from grade to the eave line, but is not exclusively at the top of the building. And I'll try to show you that here. So as you can see, you have one of the units, you have another unit, and as you can see by this articulation here, this unit is stepped back from this unit and this unit by 0.61 of a meter, adding some of the building articulation. However, the requirement of the building setback or step back, excuse me, from the eave line is this portion of the building here. This is the eave line. And so the requirement would be for this portion of the building to be stepped back by 1 meter, as well as this portion of the building to be stepped back by 1 meter. The buildings have a high degree of articulation, breaking up the perceived massing from the street, mitigating the impact for this variance, and given that it is only related to this portion of the building. For these reasons, administration is supportive of this variance as well. The fourth variance is to the maximum canopy projection into the rear yard. The regulation allows for a canopy to project a maximum of 0.61 meters into the rear yard. The proposed projection, as shown on your screen here, is to the rear property line. This is to ensure the bicycle parking is sheltered and secure and conforms with the Town of Kenmore engineering, design, and construction guidelines. The canopy will also provide additional shelter to the walkway from the rear lane into the site. For these reasons, administration is supportive of this variance as well. There are also a couple other items related to amenity space that I'd like to point out. Section 8.7.0.1 stipulates that children's playground equipment or other recreational amenities shall be required on sites with 10 or more dwelling units to the satisfaction of the development authority. So there's a bit of discretion that is built into this regulation. No children's equipment has been provided on site. This is due to the proximity of the playground that is located within walking distance, which is 125 meters to the south, as shown on the map. Given the proximity to this playground, administration is satisfied that the intent of this regulation is met. Further, with amenity space, the proposed balconies facing the inner open space area are facing each other and overlooking private outdoor amenity spaces within the site. The applicant has proposed to provide solid railings for these balconies to increase the privacy of the yard areas. And as a result, administration is satisfied with the intent of this, that the intent of this regulation is also met. There are a couple other issues that are proposed to be resolved through the conditions of the approval. The first being the entrance to the building are meant to be a prominent part of the facade and not to be located at the side of the building. The entrances are located at the front of the units. However, additional architectural articulation is needed to make them more of a prominent aspect of the front facade. Therefore, a condition to frame the entrances has been included as a condition. The applicant has elected to pay a levy for use of the town's solid waste services. So this has also been added as a condition. And 3 separate lots make up the proposed site, and these sites will be required to be consolidated into one parcel, again, as a condition of the development permit. Now, I'd like to take some time to provide the policy framework or the policy overview for this application from both the municipal development plan and the area redevelopment plan for TP Town. And the policy framework that supports this application. So firstly, the municipal development plan, for those that may not know, is the town's overarching policy document that provides direction on land use and growth and development within the community, within the entire community. The TP Town Area Redevelopment Plan also provides direction building on the municipal development plan. So direction on land use and growth and development. However, it is for a specific area or a specific community within Kenmore, and that in this case is for TP Town. This is important because both the municipal development plan and the TP Town Area Redevelopment Plan provide clear direction from council to support common amenity housing in this specific district and community. I will first go through the MDP policy direction, but before I do, it's important to note that common amenity housing is a form of market affordable housing. Market affordable housing essentially means a variety of housing types where affordability is achieved not through controlling price directly, which is a form of non-market affordable housing, but it's rather achieved through things such as building design, building size and configuration, and so on. Therefore, common amenity housing is intrinsically a form of market affordable housing because of its shared accommodation function. And so it's important to note that. It is also important to note that it is intended to provide for a potential form of housing for employees, although not exclusively stated through the definition. So we have common amenity housing as a form of affordable housing, and also for it to be an option to also provide employee housing within the community. The municipal development plan provides clear direction and support for affordable housing within the community. I have highlighted a few specific policies in the report, and I will highlight a few here for context. Up on your screen, you will see the MDP affordable housing goals. I'd like to just point out a couple of them. One is to integrate affordable housing throughout the town, to cooperate with local businesses and the construction and development industry in finding innovative solutions to provide affordable housing for employees, and to remove barriers and facilitate development of affordable housing according to needs and demand. So these are the overarching goals of the town for the provision of affordable housing within the community. These are backed up by a couple policies, more than one policy, but I'm going to highlight a couple here if they're relevant to this application. The development and construction of affordable market and non-market housing opportunities within existing and new neighborhoods is supported in order to ensure Canmore remains an inclusive and diverse community. Multiple unit residential developments should generally be dispersed throughout neighborhoods to provide a mix of housing types in all areas. And private initiatives to create additional seasonal and permanent employee housing opportunities should be supported by the town. Affordable housing should be integrated and distributed throughout Canmore neighborhoods, with preference given to locations within a reasonable area of the town center, commercial and mixed use areas, as well as transit stops. And it's important to note that this location has all of these criteria. Similar to the municipal development plan, the TP Town Area Redevelopment Plan provides policy direction on land use, growth, and development within this specific community. TP Town is divided into 3 areas. And again, you've already seen this concept. They are mixed use, low to medium density, and medium density. The proposed development is located in the low to medium density area, the purpose of which is displayed on the screen. Building on the direction established in the MDP, the TP Town Area Redevelopment Plan provides further specific direction for supporting common amenity housing within the TP Town community. This is stated through a policy that states accessory dwelling units and common amenity housing shall be supported in this area of TP Town. Development incentives may be used to encourage these types of uses. So again, this reinforces the clear council direction and support for common amenity housing in this area of TP Town. The specific policy direction was provided in the report, and the policy development generally aligns with the purpose and policy direction of the area redevelopment plan. So, and this is specific to that it consists of a medium density residential development, includes townhouses and common amenity housing. It preserves mature trees, proposes a contemporary style of architecture, and building and entrance faces the street. In summary, this application is for a permitted use townhouse and a discretionary use common amenity housing. Considerations for the application is that the application generally aligns with the applicable policy direction of the town and this neighborhood, particularly providing a form of market affordable housing in an existing neighborhood by including common amenity housing. Consists of a multi-unit residential development that provides greater density and more variety and mix of housing types. It contributes to greater inclusivity and the gradual redevelopment and change of an existing neighborhood. The residential use located within an existing established neighborhood. It's located within close proximity and walking and biking distances to services and employment, including along Bow Valley Trail and the downtown. It is located within close proximity to public transit and the newly established multimodal pathway along Bow Valley Trail, of which there will be further expansions along the east side of Bow Valley Trail. The development is well accessed from First Avenue and a rear lane and will connect to existing utilities that are already in place within the neighborhood, so no new infrastructure is required for this. The development is consistent with the land use district by offering a mix of residential housing forms at a medium density and provides inclusive housing options within the community. A sustainability screening report was submitted for the application. This has indicated that the proposed development will have a significant positive impact on the community. This is primarily as a result of the inclusion of common amenity housing, and that the common amenity housing can be used for employee housing. Now, with this, it is important to note that while the intent is for the common amenity housing to provide housing for employees in Kenmore, there is no requirement that would ensure that this occurs. Common amenity housing, as a result of its form and design, can accommodate housing for employees as suggested. However, there is no mechanism that would be enforceable if the units were not to be used for housing employees. What common amenity housing does achieve is an increase to the number of housing options available to those living within the town, and increase the diversity of people who call Kenmore home, and in turn creates a positive impact within the community. The Kenmore Planning Commission considered and approved the application as it aligned with the town's goals and policies related to providing additional housing in a form that contributes to increased market housing and potential employee housing within Kenmore. The recommendation is that the Subdivision Development Appeal Board approve the development permit application PL 2021-0423, subject to the recommended conditions of the approved set out in Schedule A. I did mention this earlier, so I won't go through this, but these are the options for the board to consider today. That does conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Weldon. I will have one or two questions, but I wanted first to see if Mr. Scott and Mr. Bell had any questions for you. Mr. Scott? Okay, thank you. Mr. Bell?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I do have a couple of questions for Mr. Weldon. Thanks very much, Mr. Weldon, for your presentation. It's quite helpful. On the common amenity housing development, I have a couple of questions to start with. The first one, has there been another common amenity housing development approved by the Development Authority elsewhere in Kenmore?
Through the chair to Mr. Bell, no, not in the formal sense of the use as a common amenity housing. Now, there was a development that has been approved that is essentially a common amenity housing development in town. However, it was approved under a separate use because the common amenity housing use was not established at that time. The common amenity housing use was established through our new land use bylaw in 2018. So there is one existing development within town, although it wasn't approved under the common amenity housing use.
Okay, thank you. So given that this is the first one that's being approved, I do want to take my time in understanding this use definition against what's being proposed. And so my first question is, does the private bathroom design component of the proposed development conform to the definition? And the reason I'm asking that is the definition of common amenity housing means a building with separate sleeping facilities, which this one certainly has, and common washing, sanitary, and kitchen facilities. So would you please address that?
Sure. Yeah. Through the chair to Mr. Bell, that's an excellent question. So I'm going to answer this with a bit of background because I think the background for this definition will help put things into perspective. So the actual use, the use is defined as you have mentioned, that common amenity housing means a building with separate sleeping facilities and common washing, sanitary, and kitchen facilities. So to understand the intent of the common amenity housing, it's important to understand the context. So this use is meant to provide a use that fulfills a function of employee housing. Without actually referencing the type of person or the user as part of the use. So what I mean by that is that the use describes what is occurring on the site or the land in terms of its function and its activity, so such as a dwelling or a residence, and not necessarily who would be fulfilling that function or activity, such as an employee. So the land use bylaw, you may have heard of this term, regulates the use, not the user. So I'm going to use an example, and this may sound a little strange, but so we have employee housing. Now, if you put this into context and using another example, let's say like scientist housing, for example, and that sounds a little bit silly, but if you use the same rationale, everybody who resides in the dwelling must be a scientist. Now, that's not appropriate. So, and so too is requiring everybody to live in the dwelling to be an employee, although it's meant to fulfill an important need within the community. So we're trying to separate out the user from the use. So the town was very aware of this, and so in the last development of the latest land use bylaw, the common amenity housing was created, and this is meant to provide an alternative to the employee housing use, which still exists within the land use bylaw. So that's just for a little bit of context. Now, when the common amenity housing use was developed, as part of the research that was used to go into this use, that staff went to visit a common amenity housing development that had been developed in Banff. And this was meant to accommodate employees. Now, this development was very similar to the proposed development, and it consisted of units where people resided in a shared living arrangement with a combination of shared and common and private aspects of the dwelling unit, such as bedrooms, washing areas, bathrooms, and cooking facilities. So after visiting the facility, the common amenity housing definition was drafted and then ultimately included in the latest version of the land use bylaw. So now, this definition was not, as you can see, it's quite broad, and it was not meant to be specific or exclusionary, but instead it was kept broad purposely to allow for and accommodate a wide range of development options for common amenity housing. So the proposed common amenity housing development, in my opinion, does meet this definition, but I think I understand your point, is that the proposed development has bedrooms that has private sanitary or bathrooms within each of the bedrooms.
That's correct.
Yeah. So again, if you go back to the intent, that the definition was not meant to be this specific when it comes to being what is considered common or what is meant to be shared. So for example, like the intent was to accommodate a shared living situation where people cohabitate and share common household amenities. And I don't think it was meant to ensure that a bathroom was meant to be shared as part of the dwelling or the common amenity housing configuration. I don't think that's appropriate for the town to be regulating that a dwelling unit needs to have a common bathroom. Now, I do understand when you do read the definition, it does read that way. But I think if you look at it through its intent, that it is meant to fulfill the cohabitation and the shared accommodation and to have shared aspects of that dwelling. I think that the intent of this definition is met in this case.
Okay, thank you. Through the chair, I have a supplementary question for Mr. Wilton on this. So that's helpful explanation to try to understand the intent behind these words. Now, where does the line, again, because this is the first time that SDAB is seeing this form of housing before it. And so where does the line get drawn as to when it becomes separate dwelling units? Because right now, administration is treating an entire floor as one dwelling unit, including for purposes of calculation of density. And so is it, you're taking the view at administration that including private bathrooms within the sleeping quarters, that's within the scope of the definition. That's also not creating an additional dwelling unit. It's still just one floor equals one dwelling unit. Do you start to draw the line when there are somehow additional kitchen facilities that are being within these separate, let's call them employee units? How's the town, because this is the first development, then there's going to be we know it's a matter of public record that others are being proposed. So I think this is important to really understand this.
Yeah, through the chair to Mr. Bell, again, excellent points. We have the definition of common amenity housing within the land use bylaw. We only have one other regulation within the land use bylaw, and that is the requirement of a parking study to determine the appropriate amount of parking. That is the only regulation related to common amenity housing in our land use bylaw. So there is a certain degree of interpretation and discretion that is needed when considering this use. And your question is an excellent one. At which line providing private bathrooms within a bedroom, within a space, within a dwelling unit space, where does it start to become each one of the bedroom areas if they were to have a kitchen facility or other amenities that are meant to be common to be considered as an actual dwelling unit itself. And yeah, and I think, in this case, I think it's reasonable when you look at each of the dwelling units and how they've been configured, that the common elements that are shared when you do look at the layout, it does meet that common amenity housing definition and the intent of it, because the majority of those facilities and those amenities within each of those units are shared. Now, if it's pushed to providing some cooking facilities within the bedrooms, or has having more of a recreation area within each of the bedrooms, now I think that is where we would need to consider that is now beyond this definition and doesn't meet the intent of this common amenity housing definition. So, but in this case, I do believe that it does. But right now, I guess my interpretation or administration's interpretation would be that it does meet it, although the sanitary facilities are within each bedroom.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weldon, Mr. Bell, for your questions. I note that Ms. Miller has raised her hand. Before we move to you, Ms. Miller, just wondering, Mr. Bell, if you have any follow-up questions?
No further questions on that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Anything further? No? Okay, Ms. Miller, would you like to address the question as well?
Thank you, Madam Chair, to Mr. Bell. Just wanted to give a little bit more background as someone who was involved in the development of the definition of common amenity housing during the development of our land use bylaw that was adopted in 2019. We did acknowledge that this is a new definition and that the wording was really going to be tested by means of the applications that came through the door. So we recognize that the definition may not be flawless, but we wouldn't be able to really understand where the definition could be refined until we started to get applications. And as you noted, in your comments, this is the first one. So as through this process, we will be able to better determine how we can clarify the definition and maybe include those clarifications in our upcoming omnibus report that we bring forward to council every year. So applications that come through the department is really what feeds the department in clarifying its definition. So we recognize they're not all perfect, but we continue to try to refine them as more applications, and we see different configurations and different proposals help us to do that. So I just wanted to note that we knew that some things would come forward that might not fit the letter of the definition, but it would help us figure out how to refine that definition in order to ensure that those types of applications could be included.
Thank you for the additional comment. Anything following from that, Mr. Bell?
No, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And Mr. Weldon, I do have one question for you as well. Similar to Mr. Bell, and somewhat in parallel, I noted that the buildings at the back of the proposed development are comprised of 2 townhouses and then the 3 5-bedroom common amenity housing units. I've also taken note of the definition of townhouses, which refers to 3 or more buildings that are attached from the ground to the roof. I note some discrepancy there. I'm wondering if you could comment on the discrepancy and whether or not you see it conforming to this definition or to another category that is a permitted or discretionary use for the land use district. Thank you.
Sure, Madam Chair, thank you. If it's okay, if I could maybe defer this question to a little bit later in the meeting, as it'll give me, I just need a little bit of time to go in and read those definitions. And then I think I'd be in a better position to be able to respond to your question, if that's okay.
Certainly, Mr. Weldon, sorry to put you on the spot.
And no, that's okay.
We do appreciate your comments on the questions. So we will have some time for concluding remarks. So if you could prepare some comments at that point, we would appreciate to hear them.
Will do. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Nothing further question. Oh, sorry, Mr. Bell, please proceed.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I do have a couple other questions for Mr. Weldon. One relates to the ARP, and it's section 3.1 of the ARP, which I'll just read into the record. Increases in residential density to be smallest within the core area of the plan area or along First Avenue. Existing single detached homes will be replaced only by building forms such as duplexes and townhomes. So I believe, Mr. Weldon, that along First Avenue in the subdistrict A is to some extent what 3.1 is talking about. So I would like your views, please, on how that is to be interpreted along with the other provisions of the ARP and the MDP that you referred to in connection with the common amenity housing.
Sure, through the chair to Mr. Bell. Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm just reading that section of the area redevelopment plan now. Now, I think what I'll do again, if I can ask Mr. Bell, is just to have a bit more time. I can answer this question again, maybe through my closing remarks at the end of the meeting. And yeah, just give me a little bit of additional time to review this and be able to respond.
Mr. Bell, is that acceptable?
Yes, that's acceptable, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Madam Chair and Mr. Will, just so I understand your question, can you please repeat your question just so that I can take a note of it, and just so that I know what I'm going to be responding to.
Mr. Bell, would you like to restate your question?
Yes, what I'm asking about is, the SDAB needs to look at all of the applicable provisions of the ARP, the MDP, and the bylaw. This section 3.1 is saying increases in residential density are to be smallest within the core area or along First Avenue. And I'm just wondering, do you consider that to be applicable, that particular provision to be applicable to this development? And if so, why? If not, why not? And just so that we can consider that as we work on our decision.
Thank you for that clarification. And my question, Mr. Weldon, was whether or not the two buildings at the back of the property conform with the definition of townhouse. And if they do not, do the buildings belong to a category that is a discretionary or permitted use for the land use district? Thank you.
Chair, I have one other line of questions, and I don't know whether now is the time to ask them, and it may be to Mr. Kinsey, but it relates to the parking study.
Well, we have members of the town administration available for questions right now. I would invite you to ask the question, Mr. Kinsey, and hope that he can respond. If not, we'll give him an opportunity to respond later. Mr. Kinsey, are you available?
I am.
Thank you. Please proceed, Mr. Bell.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Mr. Kinsey, as you know, the board has received a number of submissions from neighbors that have expressed concerns around parking. And as Mr. Weldon said, the parking was determined through the parking study, which is, he also said, is the only standard in the bylaw that relates to common amenity housing. So I'd just like to know, does administration agree with the conclusions of the parking study that 12 vehicle stalls would likely be an oversupply under most operations on the site?
Based on the information presented in the parking study, which did a jurisdictional scan and also looked at another comparable development within the town of Kenmore and actual utilization rates of parking at that development, town administration reviewed and accepted the parking study. So yes, it is fair to say that the town is accepting of the number of stalls proposed.
Okay, thank you. Through the chair, supplementary question, was there a supporting transportation impact assessment required in connection with the study?
Through the chair to Mr. Bell, no, a TIA was not deemed necessary for this application.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you both. Any follow-up questions from you, Mr. Scott? Thank you, Mr. Scott. Thank you, Mr. Bell and town administration. I would now like to ask the appellant to make their presentation with respect to their appeal. Mr. Hennessy.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You.
Just give me a second. I want to thank the board for giving me the opportunity to speak to our group's appeal. I'd like to start by giving the appeal board the motivation for this appeal, which is based in large part on the TP Town Area Redevelopment Plan. This has been discussed a couple of times already by Mr. Bell. I just want to reiterate some of the points made. The initial TP Town Area Redevelopment Plan was approved by Town Council in 2005. In the 15 years following approval, only 17% of structures in TP Town are redeveloped. In 2017, a formal review of the area redevelopment plan began that sought feedback from residents. This culminated in the final TP Town ARP that was formally approved by council in July 2020. Since 2017, a great deal of progress has been made with the redevelopment in the community. Many new housing units, primarily triplexes and fourplexes, have been built. Many of the former single-family homes have been purchased by developers in anticipation of further development. TP Town is going to be dramatically changed over the next few years. Now, on page 6 of the ARP, section 3.1, referred to by Mr. Bell, a zoning diagram is provided. That diagram shows that First Avenue from Hospital Place to 15th Street is zoned as a low to medium density area. I'm not sure if it's possible for Katie to provide that diagram to the group, but if it is, that'd be great. To many of the residents in TP Town, that implied that redevelopment in this quite small area would be primarily family-oriented housing. That is some combination of duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhouses with modern mountain architecture. Since 2018, that is what has been built throughout this area of TP Town. First Avenue was primarily a single residential unit area. It's gradually being redesigned to be, as I said, triplexes and fourplexes. In the new ARP, the area to the north and west of First Avenue is zoned as medium density. To many residents in TP Town, that implied that more high-density housing, like small apartment buildings and staff housing, would be built in that area. That, I think, was the promise of the new ARP and why many people decided to buy housing on First Avenue and on 13th and 15th Streets. Now we come to the proposed development. The development subject to this hearing takes 3 existing single-family homes on First Avenue and replaces them with 4 buildings consisting of 13 townhouses and 6 staff housing units. So 19 units in total, as was described by Riley. Each of the 13 townhouses will have 3 bedrooms, while each of the 6 staff housing units will have 5 bedrooms, with the 5 bedrooms sharing a common kitchen and living space. Therefore, the approved development will have a total of 69 bedrooms. That is 39 in the townhouses and 30 in staff housing. Assuming a person per bedroom, the implication that it'll be a minimum of 69 people living in the approved development. But since 30 of the bedrooms will be staff housing, it is well known that staff housing in the Bow Valley often exceeds normal occupancy limits. It is highly probable that many of the staff housing units will house 2 people. If so, that implies there could be 99 people living in the approved development. But even with an average of only 1.5 people per bedroom in the staff housing, the approved development would house 84 people. And it is important to remember that the approved development replaces 3 single-family homes that originally housed fewer than 10 people. So essentially, with the new development going ahead, we're replacing 10 people with upwards of 99. The conclusion is that the approved development would not meet the area's allowed low to medium density zoning requirement. It is our contention that the board should overturn the development approval based solely on it not meeting the zoning requirements of the area. Again, it was the understanding of many people who bought in TP Town on First Avenue, around First Avenue, that much of this high density housing would be built to the north and west of First Avenue. This proposed development overturns that. The appellant group's second major issue regarding the approved development concerns parking and traffic flow. The approved development provides 14 parking stalls for the 13 townhouses. This is very tight, given that upwards of 39 people will be living in the 13 units. Based on observation, the average number of vehicles per housing unit in TP Town is at least 1.5. This implies that the approved development should have allowed for about 20 parking stalls. While that is an issue, the real parking problem concerns the staff housing units. The development plan provides for 12 parking stalls for 6 units, each with 5 bedrooms. That is 12 parking stalls for 30 bedrooms and upwards of 60 people. To say the least, this is not adequate. The development plan does provide for many bike parking stalls, and yes, in Kenmore, biking is a very popular mode of transit, but the vast majority of households in Kenmore own vehicles. This is the case since Kenmore is a mountain community with long winters, and we're 110 kilometers away from a major city and close to 4 national parks and a vast provincial park. As well, the public transit system is very limited in terms of locations visited and frequency of service. Also, there are no transit stops within TP Town. In Kenmore, people have vehicles and they drive. It is not realistic to suggest that people will regularly bike to Calgary or to Lake Louise or to hiking trails off Smith Doreen Trail. Anticipating an average of 1.5 vehicles per housing unit is not unrealistic. Consider how many vehicles there will be in an approved development with 19 units and upwards of 90 people. The whole area around First Avenue, 13th Street, Mountain Avenue, and Hospital Place will see vastly increased traffic, and the streets will become like parking lots. At the February 23rd CPC meeting, where this application was considered, comments were made suggesting that it would be great if people didn't drive vehicles, but rather took public transit or biked and walked everywhere they wanted to go. Further, it was stated that by not providing parking spaces in a housing development, residents wouldn't have vehicles. But that's not reality. People have vehicles for convenience and ease of living. Not providing parking spaces in a housing development is not going to mean people won't have vehicles. It just means that the whole neighborhood will become congested with vehicles and reduce the quality of life for everyone living there, particularly for the people living in the approved development. Not providing parking spots is not going to solve Kenmore's traffic problems or reduce the number of vehicles on the roads. Finally, it goes without saying, but more vehicles lead to more traffic. There are many young children now living in the area around the approved development. There are no sidewalks, no street lights, and the roads are very narrow. With increased traffic comes a higher probability of accidents involving people walking on streets crowded with parked cars. The approved development will not have a significant positive impact on the community. It will have a significant negative impact on the neighborhood. In May 2020, Councillor Joanne McCollum made the following comment regarding the new TP Town area redevelopment plan to the Rocky Mountain Outlook. Should the vision of the group move forward through third reading and into regulation, it would make it easier for residents to reimagine their properties and therefore make it easier for planning and engineering to work together. At the time of the comment, I don't think many residents imagined this type of development on First Avenue or the possible impact it could have on their properties. Given that this is the first development of this type in Kenmore, we are acting as the test case. I guess the pertinent question then is, what would you want, or would you want this test case in your neighborhood? I'll leave it at that for the time being and thank the board for allowing me to make my comments towards support of the appeal.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy. We appreciate your presentation. Mr. Scott, Mr. Bell, any questions for Mr. Hennessy? Mr. Bell, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy, for your presentation. Regarding your concerns around parking, I'm wondering if you have any specific comments on the parking study that are part of the materials and that was prepared in accordance with the regulation.
Yeah, the parking study relied on general, essentially quotas of the number of parking spots that should be available based on the numbers of units in the building. And I think they used 3 different examples. I think I have a note on that. Just give me 1 second. Based on other jurisdictions, actually the study came up with there should be between 10 and 21 spaces. I think the Institute of Engineering parking demand tool suggested 9 spaces, and the Peaks in Canmore suggested 2 spaces per unit or 12 spaces. So given 2 of the 3 rules of thumb they used, there are fewer spaces than allowed. Also, I've talked to some people over at the Peaks in Canmore, the other side of the Trans-Canada, and my understanding is parking is a nightmare in that development. My understanding is that if you come back home anytime after about 6 o'clock, it's very difficult to find parking there. Now, I don't have anybody to go on the record and support that. I was walking through that area a few weeks ago and stopped and talked to some residents, and that was their suggestion to me, that the parking is not adequate for that building. That people park in visitor parking spots, they park up on sidewalks. There's parking issues in that building. So using that as a justification for the low number of parking spaces, I don't think is supported.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy and Mr. Bell, for your questions. I would now ask whether or not there are any persons present speaking in favor of the appeal other than Mr. Hennessy that would like to speak. Take a few minutes to see. And Ms. Bravo Stewart, if you could comment on whether anyone registered in that category today would be helpful.
Yes, this is Joey. I'd like to, Madam Chair, if I could just.
Just one moment, Joey. So I have you down as speaking as neutral. So I believe the chair had asked for those speaking in support. Have you changed your position? Or are you still neutral?
Yes, I've changed my position.
Okay, just one moment, please. I'm just going to see if the first person that was on the list is available, and then I'll let the chair know. Thank you. Madam Chair, I did have one registered, Frank Koenig, but I don't see him in the meeting right now. So as Joey Young had just stated, he has changed his position to in support. So if you're happy to hear Joey Young, we can go with Joey.
Thank you, Ms. Bravo Stewart. Mr. Young, would be happy to hear your presentation.
Yes, I'll just speak in regards to support of what Mr. Hennessy has just been talking about and bringing up, and certainly thank you to the board for hearing this submission. Just for clarification, I was neutral at the previous meeting just because of the changes or proposed amendments and compromise on the development, and not having seen what that was or been involved with it. I could really not speak for or against it. There's just, I guess, certainly the parking is a major a factor. I guess there's 2 questions I would ask through you to the town, just for clarification on the presentation. And I'd also just like to note through the presentation, some of the visuals are pretty dated. So when you're using renderings and pictures, sometimes that's the case, but there's certainly a lot, as Mr. Hennessy has pointed out, there's actually a lot of development that's happened since a lot of those pictures. So just as a note. But the 2 questions I guess I would ask on that is one around the playground and access to open space, which is in the area structure plan, talking about working with the, I believe it's the Alberta Health Services or the regional authority owns that land. I guess it would be a question for clarification on this because it is part of that area structure plan. A question of what happens if the hospital expands or takes away that opportunity to open space. I guess that's a question to the town of how that would affect these types of developments, recognizing that there are a lot of families and that there's no other access to open space or playgrounds or anything that within proximity. to these developments, and that would be added with these number of units. And I guess the other question is there, talking about market-based affordability, I guess the question I have as well for clarity is, are there thresholds to that? Is there some sort of recognition? Because I guess that's the difficulty I have with this is the average units going around here for any of the units that have been going on recently are well over $1 million per. And so it's a question of ownership, I guess, as well as rental. And also, I guess, for clarification from the town is with these individual units, if there's no requirement for them to be working or residing or living within the town, I guess the question is what's stopping people as using this as a secondary bedroom suite as well, and will that address affordability or the need for staff accommodation? So I guess there's those three questions, as well as I agree with the questions around the suitability for the parking, as well as the other services, and I guess the question around density is one of my biggest concerns as well. Is what constitutes low density if this is low to medium, and where would that low density go beyond this development? So I know you can't address that as part of this, but the cumulative effect has to be recognized as part of this development. So I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Mr. Scott, Mr. Bell, any questions for Mr. Young? Thank you, and none for me either. Ms. Bravo Stewart, is there any new correspondence in favor of the appeal?
Hello, Madam Chair. So in written correspondence that was received before the deadline for the SDB package back in April 21st, there were 3 letters of support received. And then for correspondence that was received late, but it was accepted at the April 21st SDB meeting, was 2 letters in support. So in total, there's 5 letters of support for the subject appeal.
Thank you. And they were all provided in the agenda package. So the board members have received those and had an opportunity to review already.
Yes, that's correct. So the May 31st agenda package is consolidated. So all that information is in there for the board to review.
Thank you, Ms. Bravo Stewart, for clarifying. Next item is the applicant's presentation. I would ask the applicant or the applicant's agent to make a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kathleen Hatton Lake. I'm here on behalf of Arbus Mountain Homes. I'm going to set out the legal issues for the board, and then I'm going to let Mr. Hildebrand and Ms. Faber speak to the substantive portions of the development permit for you. Mr. Hildebrand obviously is the agent on behalf of Arbus Mountain Homes, and Ms. Kristen Faber is an engineer from WSP who conducted the parking study. There are 2 legal questions before the board today. First, if common amenity housing is compatible with the neighboring uses. And second, if the variance is granted, materially affect amenities use, value, or enjoyment of the neighboring properties. So I'm going to speak first to the permitted and discretionary uses proposed. Townhomes are a permitted use in this district. I'd note, Madam Chair, that you had some questions about the definition of townhomes. Townhomes includes 3 or more dwelling units in a building. Now, if common amenity housing is considered a dwelling, this is addressed because there is, of course, more than 3 dwelling units then within each structure. If the board does not find that common amenity housing is a dwelling unit, which I'd note that some of the residential uses in the land use bylaw do specifically define themselves to be dwelling units. But if you look at what a common amenity housing is and the definition of a dwelling unit, I would submit that it is a dwelling unit. But I would also note that the compromise position put forward that is certainly for the board to consider does have 3 townhomes in each of the buildings at the back, and that would then address any concerns around the definition of townhomes. But fundamentally, we would submit that this falls within the definition of townhomes on the basis that there are more than 3 dwelling units in the buildings. The second use proposed is the common amenity housing. It's a discretionary use. And I think it's important to note that this is a discretionary use that is allowed not only just in this area, but in this specific defined low to medium density area. When we look at the purpose of a discretionary use, we're assessing the particular type and character of the use and its compatibility with those adjacent uses. I'd ask the board to carefully consider the type of common amenity housing being proposed. You hear from Mr. Hildebrand about how this is targeted towards mature employees, how it's integrated into the rest of the development in alignment with the MDP, and how they've designed this to be compatible with the neighboring uses. As noted, I think quite clearly by the development planner in this case, common amenity housing was designed to address staff housing needs. And the concerns regarding that are from the appellants in this case appear to be regarding staff. Arbus Mountain Homes provided evidence from employers about the majority of their staff not having cars and needing parking, and how, in fact, common amenity housing, when it's used as employee housing, is actually better controlled because it's ultimately these people need to behave themselves, or if you lose your employment, you would also lose that housing. So there's not the same control as there would be with rental housing. I'd also note that there is nothing prohibiting an employer, and this is common in Kenmore, from purchasing a house or a building and having employees stay there. So there's nothing fundamentally unique about common amenity housing in that way. Lastly, I'd note through the chair, Mr. Bell's comments regarding the type of common amenity housing in the definition. I'd submit that you need to conduct a purposive interpretation of the land use bylaw when interpreting it. And we've heard from the development planner why a purposive interpretation supports this being considered common amenity housing. I'd also notice a discretionary use. So if the concerns raised by Member Bell is, this is the first approved as common amenity housing, although noting that there is another example in the town which is very similar but was not under that use, as it wasn't a use category at the time. It is a discretionary use, which means that ultimately the questions of if there are kitchens and bedrooms and those sort of things are evaluated by the development planner and our development authority to determine if that's appropriate, and pushing outside the bounds of that. In terms of the variances that are granted, I note that the majority of concerns that have been raised here are not about the variances. There are 4 variances granted for this development permit: the maximum density, the eave line height, the building step back above the eave line, and the canopy projection. Of those last 3, I have not heard any concerns raised by the appellants about those latter 3 variances. The core issue appears to be about really the common amenity housing, which is a discretionary use, and that's been addressed above. In the variance, which is the question of the density, the question for the board is ultimately if it unduly interferes with the amenities of the neighborhood or materially affects the use, value, or enjoyment of neighboring properties. And that's section 687, sub 3, sub D of the Municipal Government Act. There's 3 legal points that I want to highlight in respect of the variance power. First, the terms used are unduly or materially affect. This is not looking towards minor impacts of variances, but really looking to see if the variance has a significant impact on neighboring properties. I'd note the Court of Appeal has recently considered the variance test in a series of cases regarding the City of Edmonton and the Edmonton Public Libraries. And I'm just going to quote from one of them, which is neutral citation 2021 ABCA 355, in which the Chief Justice writes, quote, "The legislature evidently recognized and accepted that a variance could and would result in some permissible degree of interference with the amenities and use, enjoyment, and value of neighboring lands." So the question for the board today is really if the slight increase in density has a significant impact on these properties. And we would submit it does not. And you'll hear from Mr. Hildebrand as to why that's the case. Second, from those same cases, the Court of Appeals identified that the variance power is not limited to cases of undue hardship or unique or minor situations. Boards always need to consider if the variance power is appropriate to be used in this case, and we would submit for the same reasons the town has already stated that it's appropriate and in alignment with the statutory plans. And third, the purpose of the development standard will inform whether the appeal board's exercise of its variance power. You have to understand the purpose served by the development standard to determine whether a variance is appropriate to grant or not. That's also from those same library cases. I think that I'm not going to repeat the development planner's comments in respect of the Eaves line and height variance ones. I think those have been well explained, but I do want to briefly comment on the density variance. I'd note that the maximum density of people could be higher if we had 4 fourplexes and accessory dwelling units. Certain accessory dwellings up to a certain amount are excluded from that maximum number. So when we look at the purposes of the density maximum, I would suggest that having an additional 3 units does not undermine the purposes of that density maximum we see happening, because we know there could be accessory dwelling units that would not be counted towards that maximum. The second piece, or the third piece that I want to speak to, is the alignment with statutory plans. The board has to consider the statutory plans and must comply. I note that in this case, the municipal development plan is the most relevant statutory plan, and key consideration there is the provision of affordable housing. I'm going to also briefly address the TP Town ARP that was raised by Board Member Bell. I'd note that in 3.1 of the TP Town ARP, it says existing single detached dwellings will be replaced generally by building forms such as duplexes and townhomes. So there's not a limitation here. It's not a mandatory clause, but more importantly, I think that the proposal that you have before you today is the forms of townhomes. So it's not a building form change. When you look at the external of these buildings, there's not a different structure that's coming into play for a common amenity unit in those buildings versus a townhome unit in those buildings. And I think that's quite evidence when you see both the compromise position, but also when you look at the structures that are being proposed. I'd also note here in terms of the increases in residential density are to be smallest within the core of the plan area or along First Avenue. And I think that as we've noted, the higher increase in density is towards the back, so away from First Avenue. So the low to medium density area is really only kind of 1 street wide. So it's towards the back, adjacent to that medium density area, that you see the higher density pieces. And I would submit that what's proposed is actually directly in alignment with what's being contained in 3.1 of the ARP. In terms of the board's authority, the appellants have identified that they would be satisfied, and this is the compromise position. So they're really looking for more townhomes, fewer common amenity units. So the question for the board really then becomes about these common amenity units, which, as the town has identified, are submitted as being in alignment with the MDP and supported within the context of this ARP. The board has the ability to confirm, revoke, or vary the approval, and can make or substitute an approval decision or condition of its own. Arbus Mountain Homes supports the development permit as granted, but if there's any merit found, the appellant's concerns would be agreeable to the board looking to vary to increase the number of townhome units and decrease the number of common amenity units. The key for Arbus Mountain Homes is to be able to develop within this construction season. A denial of the permit will put Arbus Mountain Homes from reapplying for an extended period of time under section 1.10.4.8 of the land use bylaw. It's commonly known in Kenmore that housing and employee housing in particular are desperately needed. Arbus Mountain Homes wants to build that housing to meet the needs of the community. and is open to the board making variances if they find it necessary to address the appellant's concerns. It's a denial of the permit that is of significant concern because that effectively sterilizes it from proceeding with any sort of revised permit application and would prevent it from proceeding with this construction year. And I think as we can all understand, construction season in Alberta is certainly not a long window of time. Subject to any questions from the board, I'll turn it over to Mr. Hildebrand and Ms. Faber to speak to the merits of the specific portions of the appeal.
Thank you, Ms. Elhatton-Lake. I think I'll ask the board to reserve their questions until we hear from Mr. Hildebrand. And I missed the name, but you're representative with WSP. Mr. Hildebrand or WSP representative. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I begin, I will apologize. My presentation is a little bit long, and I will be repeating a few points that have already been made. Well, I'll try not to do that. But just looking at the clock, it would now be an appropriate time to take a break, or would you like me to go ahead?
I was going to propose a break at 3:30. Do you think you'll go beyond 3:30?
I hope not, but I will try and get through that. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see my screen, everyone?
Yes, but we see the presenter view. If you go to the very top where it says display settings,
Yes.
there you go. Drop that down and then swap presenter view.
There we go. Are you now seeing the slide?
Thank you. Yes, we can.
Thanks, Katie. I appreciate that. Madam Chair, board members, thank you for allowing us the opportunity to make this presentation to you this afternoon. When we considered how to develop this site, we looked at two options. We could build 4 fourplexes, or we could do a development that could address the town's need for more affordable housing and for employee housing. The development of common amenity housing is new and untested. We realized that we would be the first mover and potentially subject to the first mover disadvantage. This has turned out to be the case. If we elected to build fourplexes, we'd be 50% done by now. However, proposing something new and innovative has resulted in a 12-month development approval process that has led us to here to today. Doing the right thing is not always easy. We continue to be of the view that what we are proposing is in the best interest of the town of Kenmore, and we hope that you will agree. This presentation is intended to supplement the written materials we provided to the SDAB on April 13th. We do not intend to reiterate those written submissions. We will, of course, be pleased to expand on those written submissions should there be any queries. And again, I'll apologize in advance if there's areas of repeat from what have been made by the development officer. Attached is the agenda. We've already heard point number 1 from Kathleen. And I'd like to clarify that any mention of employee housing in that definition by us is not referring to the town of Canmore's land use bylaw definition of employee housing that states employee housing means 1 or more dwelling units used exclusively for the residence of employees or members of their family. In our written submissions, we have used the words employee accommodation to refer to the use of common amenity housing that will be restricted to the use by employers for their employees. And I'll expand on this later in my presentation, but I think it's a key point I'd like you to keep in mind. Next slide, we were asked to comment on the common amenity housing definition. The definition is there, you've already seen it. We submit that the CPC approved development permit meets the definition of common amenity housing. The proposed common amenity housing units will be set in separate buildings with shared laundry, washroom, kitchen, and common areas. As we noted within our written submissions, this project was developed to attract more mature employees who desire one washroom per sleeping unit. While we anticipate that most of the sleeping rooms will house one employee, we are not of anywhere to restrict the use of each sleeping room and have no intention of doing so. Therefore, each of the washrooms will in fact be common facilities. We note that council has recently approved amenity housing at 500 Bow Valley Trail, where some of the proposed units would have washing and sanitary facilities located in each sleeping room. Therefore, there is a precedent that amenity housing in Kenmore does not require shared bathrooms. We note that dwelling unit, as defined in the land use bylaw, means a self-contained room or suite of rooms which normally provide sleeping, washing, sanitary, and kitchen facilities. So clearly, each sleeping unit is not a dwelling unit as kitchens are not provided. And I hope that helps Mr. Bell. Now I'd like to talk about the appellant issues. We will touch on each of the appellant issues and then expand on them through this presentation. To start, Kristen will address the parking and traffic issues. I'll just talk briefly about the other issues and then expand them as we go. So employee accommodation is prevalent in TP Town neighborhood and in many neighborhoods in Canmore. Employees are not bad people. They're the people who bring us our dinner at restaurants and who teach our children how to bike or ski. The notion that these type of people are not wanted in any neighborhood is not appropriate. The density cliff, or there is a density cliff between the TP Town areas A and B. Unit densities in TP Town are not uniform. Densities don't include accessory dwelling units, presumably to encourage their development, which masks the true density within the neighborhood. TP Town is not solely a single family neighborhood at present, but it could be more so with the proposed development and with future developments. We will meet the town's commitment to have single family housing along First Avenue. The proposed employee housing or employee accommodation units were purposefully moved to the rear of the property and sandwiched between the rear townhomes to be away from the other Area A neighbors. We submit that this project will enhance the town amenities. TP Town is prone to flooding. As properties are redeveloped, the town requires enhancements, which include storm drains, higher main level elevations, no basements, sidewalks, additional recycling and garbage facilities, and fire hydrants. We will pay for all of these amenity improvements that will be of benefit to the neighborhood. In addition, we are proposing to bury the overhead power lines along the alley behind our property. Some opposed to the development are suggesting that there should be more on-property parking. Any proposed land use bylaw change that would require more parking are outside the scope of this hearing and should not be considered grounds for appeal. Our project meets the land use parking requirements, land use bylaw parking requirements. I'd now like to turn it over to Kathleen, who will speak to the parking and traffic issues. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dale. Kristen, you said Kathleen, but my name is Kristen Faber. I'm a transportation engineer with WSP in Canmore. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Please let me know when you can see it.
That looks good, Christine.
Thank you. So as I said, my name is Kristen Faber. I'm a transportation planning engineer with WSP in Canmore. We were commissioned by Arbus Mountain Homes to complete a parking study to determine if the parking supply for the amenity housing portion of the development would be sufficient. So first, I'll just do an overview of the parking study. So as we've heard, the proposed parking supply at the Bald Eagle Peak Chalet for the amenity housing portion is 12 spaces, which works out to 2 spaces per unit. In order to determine if this would be a sufficient supply, we looked at a number of resources. So the first thing we did was do a jurisdictional scan of similar sized mountain and resort style communities. So that included Revelstoke, BC, Vernon, BC, and Jasper, Alberta. And we considered what their parking standards were for similar types of development. So based on that, we were seeing that between 10 and 21 parking spaces would be required for this type of development in any one of those communities. So we also looked at a similar development in Kenmore, at the peaks of Kenmore on Palliser Trail. At this site, there are similar units that have 5 bedrooms each with a common living space. And we inquired about the parking situation for those units. So it was indicated to us that the absolute maximum amount of parking that they would provide to these units is 2 spaces per unit. However, the amount that's actually provided depended on what was available at the time of the request. So they actually aren't providing 2 spaces per unit. They're providing 7 stalls for all of these 8 units, so less than 1 space per unit. And when we were in touch with the property manager there, they also indicated that some residents of these units didn't require any parking. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that residents of this type of housing may not require parking at all. So the last resource we looked at was the ITE Parking Generation Manual. That's the Institute of Transportation Engineers. So this manual summarizes a collection of parking demand data based on land use type. So basically you can look up a land use and it provides you with a means of calculating the potential demand. So for this site, we looked at the affordable housing land use and the estimated demand was 9 parking stalls. So just in summary, based on all of these resources, we saw that between 9 and 21 parking spaces would be required for the amenity housing. So some other information that informed our study was the provision of 66 spaces for bicycle parking for the employee housing, which includes 20 interior bike lockers and 46 exterior spaces. We also considered the location of the site in relation to amenities, like a grocery store is an 8-minute walk or a 3-minute cycle. Main Street is a 15-minute walk or a 7-minute cycle. And the nearest Rome transit stop is 6-minute walk and a 2-minute cycle. There are also other Rome transit stops within a 10 to 12-minute walk of the site as well. We also looked at some data on car ownership. So we gathered some information from Click Hotels and Resorts and Banff Caribou Properties. Click Hotels and Resorts houses 65 of their employees and advised that less than 15% of their employees that live in this type of housing own or have access to a car. Banff Caribou Properties has developed and owns numerous types of housing for employees, and they indicated that typically car ownerships for residents of employee housing is between 10 and 15%. So if you apply 15% to the Bald Eagle Peak Chalet amenity housing, saying that 15% of the amenity housing residents will own or have access to a vehicle, even if the rooms are double occupied, that would only be a demand for 9 vehicle parking spaces, which we're exceeding. So based on that information, the conclusion of the parking study was that the amount of parking for the amenity housing would be sufficient. And that was also in recognition of the town's mode share targets. I also just wanted to briefly touch on traffic generated by the development. So we looked at the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Manual, which is similar to the Parking Generation Manual. So the Trip Generation Manual summarizes data on the number of trips generated based on land use. So for the proposed land use, including the townhouses and amenity housing units, we're looking at about 78 daily trips. And then if you calculate it based on the existing single family homes, we're looking at 40 daily trips. So the difference is an additional 38 trips per day, which is fairly insignificant in the grand scheme of things. So thank you. That's it for the parking and traffic, and I'll turn it back over to Dale for the rest of his presentation.
Mr. Hildebrand, please proceed.
All right, thank you. So can you see my screen again?
Yes, but I believe that it's not in the presentation view. I believe you need to still start the presentation. Okay, perfect. So now you'll just have to hit the display settings one more time. Perfect, and then swap. Perfect. So all we see now is parking and traffic slide.
Great, thank you, Katie. I greatly appreciate your help. All right, moving on then, thank you. So who are the residents around this proposed development? The following graphic was developed using land title information. So those noted as owner occupied is where the owner address is the same as the land address, implying that the owner lives within the home, or at least did so when the land title was last updated. So less than half of the homes around the development are owner occupied. Non-owner occupied is where the owner address is different than the address on land title or the land address. So very likely these properties are rented, and this complies with our experience in the neighborhood. And then finally, the purple ones are developer owned. So these are owners that we know to be developers. Most of these properties have been purchased in the last 2 years in response to the updated ASP. And are slated for development. And several of these, 1407 is proceeding, 1413 is proceeding, and other properties are currently in the development approval process. I'd like to talk more about employee accommodation. So we are concerned with employee accommodation being disruptive to the neighborhood and to the buyers of our townhomes. And in that respect, we share the appellant's concerns. This is why we've committed to put controls in place to minimize any negative impacts from the employee accommodation. So employee housing is already prevalent in TP Town, and our project was designed for more mature employees as outlined in our written submissions. The homes we have that are currently being used for employee housing. So the three lots, these 3 homes, we have groups of 3 to 6 people that have rented each of these 6 units, the main floor and the basements. These 15 unrelated individuals share common amenity spaces, and they're all working employees in Kenmore. We note that the appellants have advised us that they had no issues with these employees living in these homes in their neighborhood. 1425 Banff Caribou Properties owns 2 properties in TP Town that are used for employee accommodation and have been for many years. So we suspect that there are many other homes that are used for employee accommodation in TP Town that we're simply not aware of. Employee housing is also prevalent in many other neighborhoods in Kenmore. The document referenced under footnote number 1 in our April 13th, 2022 written submission shows the type of housing currently being used for employee housing in Kenmore. This document, which was published by the Job Research Center in 2019, is called the Staff Housing Guide. It lists most of the larger employers in Kenmore and the types of housing provided. If we're going through the guide, one can see that there are hundreds of employees being accommodated in various neighborhoods in Kenmore in various types of housing, including single-family homes, condominium units, and apartments. And I'd just like to take a moment to share this guide with you. So under each of the potential large employers, or what's shown here, say for Cleek, Blackstone Mountain Lodge, 45 staff in the summer, 30 in the winter. And their lists here, they have 2 2-bedroom units in a condo building, 4 2-bedroom units, and 1 3-bedroom house. So that's the employee housing or accommodation that is provided for that unit. And if you go through each of these different ones, you'll see, for Cleek at Malcolm, newer homes with 30 shared bedrooms. Stone Ridge, a variety of apartments located around Kenmore. And what you can see is that there's hundreds of employees that are accommodated in all kinds of apartments and condos and houses throughout Kenmore. So our point is that the proposed employee accommodation will not be new to Kenmore and will not be new to TP Town. The appellant's position that employee accommodation is not appropriate for their neighborhood is inconsistent with the fact that employee housing is already present in TP Town and many other Kenmore neighborhoods. Our project will replace employee housing provided in existing homes and basin suites with new units that were specifically designed to meet employers' needs and will be significantly more energy efficient and sustainable. I'd now like to play a short section from the submission we made to the CPC during the hearing on February 23rd, 2022. Bear with me while I bring that up. I did want to talk a little bit more about amenity housing versus employee housing. We are not interested in developing amenity housing. We are interested in developing employee housing. And I'm not sure what that definition is, and I'm not sure you've gotten a good sense of what that difference might be. But for me, if it was amenity housing and there was no restrictions, I could go out and if I owned that unit, I could find 5 individuals and rent them each a room and have a shared common space. That is not what we're intending to do. We are intending to either sell or lease these units to employers. And it is our intent in the bylaws of the condominium corporation to make that explicitly clear. That units 501 to 506 can only be sold or leased to employers or an employee housing cooperative, and any rental agreement between the owner or lessees of those units and the renters has to be a condition of their employment, with provisions that those renters adhere to the condominium bylaws, including access, guests, parking, quiet hours, pets, etc., etc. So these types of rental agreements between employers and their employees are very common in the Bow Valley. And most of the large employers have these type of rental agreements. And it's a way that we can have an employee housing in the community and have some control over some of those aspects, like parties, noise, etc. And as the applicant, we would accept having these provisions in our condominium bylaws as a condition of the town of Kenmore providing us with an occupancy permit. So the use of contracts between employees and employers is also noted in the correspondence to the appellants, which was attachment C and our April 13th written submissions. We also note that both Cleek and Bamcare property letters in support of our development note that they have these types of contracts with their employees. So again, I should clarify that in the video clip when I mentioned employee housing, I was not referring to the town's land use bylaw definition of employee housing. The key point here is that the use of employee-employer contracts will go a long way to addressing the appellant's concerns with noise and related issues associated with employee accommodation. And as the developer officer noted, common amenity housing is not mandated. The definition of common amenity housing does not mandate employee accommodation. However, we intend to restrict use to employees. So I'd like to provide some more context on density. So TP Town is a unique neighborhood in that the densities are not uniform and there's a density cliff between areas A and B and C, as shown on this next slide here. So area B here has a minimum density of 66 units per hectare, which means that when redeveloped, all of these single family homes at a minimum will be a fourplex on a 50-foot lot. In areas A and C, the maximum is 66 units per hectare, which is a fourplex on a 50-foot lot. So area B is adjacent to, so the project that we're proposing is here, is adjacent to the unlimited density that we've noted here. So the 9 townhomes along First Avenue will all be single family and will have a density of 73.5. Along the back with the employee housing, employee accommodation sandwiched between the other townhomes, the density will be 81. So we feel that it's appropriate that we providing a density gradient from what's seen on this side of the street and their neighbors over to the area B, which has unlimited density. So just a couple other things to note. 1200 Second Avenue was recently approved with 84 units per hectare. That was a variance and to the 66 unit per hectare area C. So we have that precedent. This property here has a development permit process where they're proposing 96 units per hectare or 143 with ADUs. And even right across the street at 1401 First Avenue with ADUs, they're at 107 units per hectare. So to confirm, there are no ADUs proposed in our development in an effort to keep sale prices affordable. So we also note that accessory dwelling units are not included in the density determinations, but they do represent separate units with separate kitchens, separate and additional parking requirements, and do increase the neighborhood densities. So we just need to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. If the appeal is granted, we will redevelop with 4 fourplexes on these lands. Our proposed orientation of the 4 buildings is a better use of the available land, results in less lot coverage and private amenity spaces compared with 4 fourplexes. So what we're proposing is to take the narrow and long side yards between the fourplex buildings and to create a wider courtyard with more usable amenity space between the buildings, which is shown here. The courtyard will be oriented to provide more sunlight into the private yards. In essence, we are taking the 3-story canyons that would exist between the fourplexes of the buildings to create outdoor amenity spaces that families can actually use. So in a neighborhood that will be predominantly long and narrow triplexes and fourplexes, this project will provide some building diversity and enhancement to the neighborhood. In the next few slides, I'd like to show some renderings comparing the proposed development to that if we went ahead with fourplexes. So in this slide is a front view. On the left is the proposed development, and on the right is a SketchUp of what 4 fourplexes would look and the associated massing. A little bit higher street view. And here a side view for the neighbors. The amenity housing or the common courtyard provides a significantly less massing against the neighbor than a long and narrow fourplex would provide. A little bit higher view showing the roof articulations. And again, the side view with the neighbor. This chart, or this slide shows some of the statistics of the proposed project compared to fourplexes. Fourplexes with ADUs will actually provide an overall higher density than the proposed project. And if this appeal is granted, we would come back and build 4 fourplexes each with ADUs. The sustainability score is significantly higher for our proposed development, which really highlights the significant desire the town of Kenmore places on sustainability or providing affordable housing. The proposed project will provide significantly more bicycle parking and additional levies to the town compared to fourplexes. And as we note here, the offsite levies and requirements for additional town infrastructure, we estimate will be about $300,000. As noted in attachment D to our April 13th written submissions, the selling price of single-family homes in Kenmore has increased about 50% in the last 18 months. Throughout Kenmore, we are seeing older housing stock being redeveloped, reducing housing for employees. So new employee accommodation is required. The town administration noted the loss of employee accommodation in TP Town due to redevelopment, and that was in attachment G of our written submission. The proposed project aligns with the municipal development plan by placing an affordable housing option in a community that is close to employment centers, town centers, and transit options. Our proposal is within easily walking distance to employment sites in the town center. The proposed project also aligns with the land use bylaw, common amenity housing use. This provision was added to the land use bylaw to encourage employee accommodation in communities like TP Town. As noted in our written submission, attachment E, the Mayor of Kenmore has struck a task force to tackle the employee housing issue. This task force has been investigating employee housing cooperative for Kenmore and supports this proposed development. We note that the town has recently approved an employee housing development at 500 Bow Valley Trail. We submit that more employee housing is required throughout Kenmore. And so now I'd like to go through the appellant's reasons for appeal and just touch on each of those briefly. So firstly, the appellant's concern with excessive occupancy, we believe, are overstated. Our proposed 69 bedrooms compared to 56 bedrooms with fourplexes does not necessarily translate into significantly more residents. For the townhome units, many families will have more than one person per bedroom. Regarding traffic and parking, Kristen has addressed those. Regarding garbage and recycling, town administration has advised us that the levies that we will be required to pay will be used to provide additional recycling and garbage facilities in the neighborhood. And as discussed, our proposed condominium bylaw controls will provide for stronger noise mitigation compared with existing employees who are simply renting homes within the neighborhood. The municipal development plan provides for alternative or less stringent architectural design standards when more affordable housing options are proposed, as noted in our written submissions. We submit that the variances requested are reasonable and appropriate in light of the community benefits being provided. The appellant's request that no variance be provided is at odds with the municipal development plan provisions. The variance requested, as Kathleen mentioned, other than density, are relatively minor in nature. These variances requested should be viewed compared to the alternative of 4 fourplexes. The next slides compare the requested variances for the proposed development with 4 fourplexes. The first one, Eave Height. The courtyard is a key component of our proposed design and reflects good planning practices. Again, eliminating the canyons between the fourplexes and replacing them with usable private amenity space will enhance the residents' experience and be positive for the neighborhood. The Eave Height variant, when viewed in context, is relatively minor, as I've shown here with these red lines. Without the Eave Height variant, there will be increased construction costs for more complex roof slopes. The proposed flat roof slopes are conducive to solar electricity generation, which we continue to pursue for this project. And all of these slopes, like these ones and these ones that are facing south and east, will be perfect for the placement of solar panels. The proposed articulations and roof slopes provided for a clear identification of units and a pleasing streetscape. We have modified the design to provide bolder front entryways as per the CPC approved DP condition. And we will be required to landscape and provide the sidewalk on town property. And this will enhance the streetscape and lessen the impact of the reduced building articulations, as the development officer has talked about. So here is actually the property line, and we will be required to provide this landscaping and sidewalk as part of our DP. So to summarize our position, the proposed project is the best use of land. It reflects good land use planning and addresses Kenmore's housing crisis. Employee accommodations with controls will minimize the impact on the neighbors through our proposed condominium bylaws. We will integrate employee accommodation into the neighborhood as required by town policy. The smaller townhomes will address housing affordability, as they will come in at a significantly lower price point than fourplexes. The graduated density is towards the Trans-Canada Highway, as it should be, and the employee accommodation was placed away from the area neighbors. So letters of support have been filed by 5 adjacent landowners for the properties shown in the green highlight. Nicole Rainey at 1302, Brian, Aaron and Megan Brandt at 1223, Chase Mullins, 1407, and Banff Caribou Properties at 1425, all in First Avenue, and Kevin Milliton at 1417 on Mountain Avenue. These neighbors represent owner occupants, existing employee housing, and other developers. So we are pleased to have several landowners supporting this proposed development. So just to reiterate our position, it is requested that the board confirm the DP is approved by the Kenmore Planning Commission. It has taken us 12 months to get to this stage, and a restart would be absolutely devastating for our small company. With respect to the compromise, we tried to do the right thing and find a solution that was acceptable to our neighbors and ourselves. If the board cannot confirm the DP, then we request that the joint compromise be considered. We submit that changes to the DP can be readily implemented by the town of Kenmore and the applicant, similar to other Schedule A conditions. If the board has other concerns, then we submit the project can be modified via approval conditions without restarting the approval process. And I'd just like to talk really quickly about the joint proposal and the compromise. Should the SDB be concerned with the quantum of employee accommodation that we're proposing. So under the joint proposal, building 5B would be replaced with 2 additional 32-foot wide townhome units. We would maintain the benefits of employee accommodation and reduce the potential impacts in half with respect to the number of residents, bedroom, parking, etc. The positive planning aspects of this project, including the courtyard, private amenity spaces, new neighborhood amenities like sidewalks and fire hydrant, would be maintained. And more importantly, the smaller townhouse with the lower selling price will be provided that will be suitable for local families. And really just to highlight, it's taking one of the employee accommodation buildings and replacing it with 2 townhome units. That was the compromise trade-off. So in conclusion, we submit that the development of 4 fourplexes on this land is not the best use. Granting the appeal and canceling the DP will force us to reapply with 4 fourplexes. We have an opportunity here to do something better. If the SDB cannot confirm the DP, then there are options to modify to keep the benefits of the townhome design with the private amenity spaces through the use of approval conditions. For example, if the SDB believes that the common amenity housing definition requires shared washrooms, then the interior layout of the employee accommodation units could easily be modified. This change could be a condition of approval. With respect, we request that the SDB confirm the CPC approved DP and not lose the opportunity to have lower cost townhome units made available for Kenmore families and for employee housing units to be integrated into the community. And finally, I'll give Kathleen an opportunity if she wants to make any closing remarks.
Thank you, Dale. I don't think there's anything else in respect of those pieces. The only one that I would note is in respect of the TP Town ARP. I just want to note sections 4.1.1, which is regarding housing choice, about providing development incentives for dwelling units that are smaller, accessory, or contain shared amenities. When we talk about things like development incentives, usually we're talking about things like varying to allow for increased density. And so this would be actually directly in alignment with what's in the ARP. Similarly, in the 4.1.2 low to medium density area, in there we see that there is a policy under 2, accessory dwelling units and common amenity housing shall be supported in this area of TP Town. Development incentives may be used to encourage these uses. So once again, we're seeing that where developers engage in socially beneficial uses, such as common amenity housing, this ARP directly supports the use of development incentives, such as increasing density. And I just wanted to note those parts, given that Board Member Bell had raised about the ARP. So I wanted to identify the pieces of the ARP where we see consistency.
Thank you, Mr. Hildebrand, Ms. Elhatton Lake, and Ms. Faber. It is 3:30. We've been sitting for a long time. I do want to give the board to ask questions, an opportunity to ask questions, but I think it's a good time to take a 10-minute break. I would ask if anything in the slides was new material, that it be sent through to Ms. Bravo Stewart during the recess, so that the board members have that to refer to in their questions when we return from recess. With that, I move the board to recess for 10 minutes. Those in favor? Thank you. None opposed? Motion passed to recess for 10 minutes to 3:42.
3:42, perfect. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
All right, it is 3:42, Madam Chair, and you can just call the meeting back to order. There's no motions not necessary.
Thank you. Call the meeting back to order at 3:42. The next item on our agenda is questioning of the board members. If any of the board members have any questions for the applicants, Mr. Hildebrand, Ms. L. Haddon Lake, or Ms. Power, please proceed. Mr. Bell, please proceed.
Thank you. Through the chair to Mr. Hildebrand. Mr. Hildebrand, on the question of parking, Chase Mullen, who did put forward a submission, as he said, generally favorable to your proposal, but raised a concern around parking.
Just really quick, Madam Chair. Dale, can you please mute? It's echoing really bad. Thank you. Jim, would you be able to repeat your question?
Yeah, it's in relation to the submission from Chase Mullen that Mr. Hildebrand referenced in his presentation. And Mr. Mullen stated that parking is, quotation marks, a nightmare in the area. And he wants the SDAB to implement rules that only certain rooms would be granted a permit for a parking spot. Not quite sure how the SDAB does that, but I would appreciate Mr. Hildebrand's comments on that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bell. I mean, I can't speak for Mr. Mullins. I did not talk to him about that specific issue. I mean, he sent in the letter of support on his own accord. I think parking's a bit of a nightmare in most neighborhoods in Kenmore, and I don't think it's going to get any better. So I guess I really don't have much more to say. We have designed the townhome units to meet the requirements of the land use bylaw to have one parking stall in the garage. People can park a second vehicle on the driveways. The town does not count that, but practically that's what happens. So that, adds another 13 parking stalls that are off street. The 12 stalls plus one visitor at the rear of the property for the common amenity housing. We spent months and months and months going back and forth with this parking study and the town of Kenmore administration to come to that conclusion that 12 was the appropriate number and designed around that. So it's not just something that was done quickly. So there's a lot of time and energy that went into that. And I know people don't necessarily like to say this, but if you look at the map, Mountain Avenue that goes along the Trans-Canada Highway, it's newly been redeveloped, and one side of that whole avenue is available for street parking. And as the density increases in that neighborhood, then some people are just going to end up parking their cars, next to the Trans-Canada along Mountain Avenue. And, it might be the appropriate place to put them. But I hope those comments are somewhat helpful.
Thank you. I do have a supplementary question. I believe one of the things that Mr. Munn was getting at is how the common amenity unit parking would get allocated amongst the rooms, and whether that was as opposed to a free-for-all is kind of what I got from his submission.
Thank you for that clarification. We haven't got there yet in determining how those parking stalls will be allocated. As you may know, within a condominium, they can be titled stalls or they can be allocated stalls. I think we will have them as allocated stalls. And if one party ends up owning all 6 units, then they can allocate them out to employees as they see fit. If it turns out that those units are sold to different employers, then my guess would be that each unit would be allocated 2 stalls, and then the owner of that unit would then allocate them out to their employees.
Thank you. Chair, I do have another question for Mr. Hildebrand. Does not relate to parking. Okay, thank you, Chair. Mr. Hildebrand, I'm interested in your proposal around the bylaw restrictions. And I guess my first question would be, is the entire development, is your idea that would be one condominium corporation? In other words, all of the townhouses as well as the common amenity housing? And then it would be, voting would be by owners and unit factors? Just wondering how the governance of this would work when you start proposing restrictions via bylaws.
Yes, my understanding is we don't really have a choice. It would be one condominium corporation for the one piece of land. So initial discussions with legal counsel are that, you know, we could impose bylaws that are restrictive for those 6 units. And our proposals that they only be owned or leased to employers, and that they need contracts between the employer and the employees, are all things that could be condominium bylaw conditions. It will be interesting to see how we manage the governance between the 13 townhouse owners and the potential 6 employee accommodation units, and the voting around those, and to make sure that one group has appropriate rights compared to the other group. So again, we've not sort of crossed all those bridges, but we are conscious that we have some work to do if we get approval.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Mr. Scott, any questions? No?
Well, I'm sitting here just, I guess probably Ms. Fabra on her, should we say her study. And I guess one of the questions I had was when you talk about the peaks, they said that they only allocated a certain number of stalls to that, which is sort of the same principle as here. But my question to you, did you ask, was there a waiting list for parking stalls to get a sense of how many people actually had vehicles, not they were allocated a stall?
I don't have an idea of what the wait list is. He indicated that some units said that they didn't need any parking, and some might have said they wanted more than 2. So it was kind of a mix of, there was some units that said, I don't need any, I don't have a car. And then there were some that said, I'd like more than 2, but they wouldn't provide more than 2.
Okay. So what I'm saying is did you get a sense from the property manager that there was a need for more parking stalls for those units?
I guess
no, I don't. There's a need.
Yeah, I don't know if they have a wait list.
Okay. The other question I had, you mentioned the Malcolm and the Cleek and so forth. And at least I believe it was in your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my comment on those, the people that work there, those are most likely, they are mainly entry-level, brand new people in town. So and they're usually young people, so they would not normally have a car, etc. Whereas Mr. Hildebrand, he is looking for the 3rd level, the more mature people. that are established here in town. And I guess that's, to me, there's a difference between even the folks up in Jasper. It's not, are they the entry-level people or the more mature people, which Mr. Hildebrand is trying to accommodate?
Right. I think there's still like a character, like if you're in this type of housing, I mean, it's related to your, probably what you can afford and your income level. So I think it's still a somewhat comparable between the two.
Okay. I guess my other question would be to Mr. Hildebrand. He's there?
Yes, sir.
Sir, if we did say that you had to provide more parking stalls, is there any way that you could accommodate that for
No.
the for those group units? Is there any way to accommodate additional stalls?
Potentially, but it would require another variance. So one of the requirements is 40% of the area needs to be landscaped, which excludes driveways and parking stalls. So we do meet that requirement of the land use bylaw. But if your determination, under a condition was that we needed to provide an extra 1 or 2 stalls, then we would be taking out green space and replacing it with pavement. And perhaps Riley can provide you some more color on that land use bylaw provision.
Okay. All right. And how close you are to the actual threshold there now?
We just met the 40%.
Okay, you're just on it now. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
I think that's my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott, Ms. Faber, and Mr. Hildebrand. Anything else from you, Mr. Bell? Thank you. I do have 2 questions. My first question is for 3 questions, I guess. My first 2 questions are for Ms. Faber. And I hope that I'm pronouncing your surname correctly. Can you please let me know where Peaks in Kenmore is located?
It's on Palliser Trail. I don't know the exact address. I could probably find it quickly.
Okay, no, Palliser.
Madam Chair, it's Dale. It's basically directly across the highway from TP Town. It's what's commonly called the Mustache Lands. And the amenity housing building there is the eastmost building that's kind of across the street from the New Catholic Church.
Thank you. And my second question, Ms. Faber, relates to visitor parking. In your study, did you do any assessment of visitor parking needs and how visitor parking is accommodated in these other locations? And tied to that, how you propose to accommodate visitors at the currently proposed development?
Visitor parking wasn't a part of the study, but there is one visitor parking stall allocated to the amenity housing units. And then, as Dale indicated as well, with the townhouse units, they have a parking spot in the garage and on the driveway. But I think it's not uncommon to how other houses along First Avenue are probably accommodating visitors. Parking is limited, so people are going to park on street, as in most residential areas.
Is there room in front of the townhouses on the green space between the driveways for a car to park if a visitor were to come? Street space left is my question.
Right. I don't know if there's any space. Maybe Dale can comment directly in front of the townhouse units, but as he mentioned, also on Mountain Avenue within walking distance, there's street parking.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Faber. Mr. Hildebrand?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the short answer is no. The distance required for parallel parking along the sidewalk is the length of the car plus 1.5 meters next to a driveway for proper sight lines. And the distance between the proposed driveways would not be wide enough. I do think, in fact, people will end up parking there, perhaps illegally, between some of the driveways that are wider. But the answer is no.
Thank you. And my final question is for Ms. Alhatton Lake, and that relates to the Edmonton Library case that you cited. And apologies, I don't know the paragraph to quote it, but the court in that case references negative effects hurdle and the use condition when assessing and applying the discretionary rights under 687. Just wondering if you could speak to the use condition and whether or not you feel that this proposed development meets the use condition given the definition of townhouse and common amenity housing.
Sorry, Madam Chair, just to be clear, so the Edmonton Library Board case, the paragraphs that I cited talked about the application of the variance test. Are you asking not about the variance test, but about if the use is met here?
The variance test has two parts. One part is the use condition and the other part is the negative effects. If you like, you can comment on that question in your concluding remarks, if you like.
So what I would say in respect of, I may reserve that just to my concluding remarks to talk about those pieces, but I think that the important piece from the library cases is how the board engages in that test. And in terms of that variance piece, it's that a variance can be granted even where there is a negative impact, but it has to be shown that it has a material, significant, or undue impact. And when you're evaluating that impact, you need to look at the purpose of those conditions. And I would submit that in respect of the variance that's really been at issue here today, the density, when we look at things like the ARP, which encourages things like allowing development incentives, which would be things like density, increases in density. We look at the MDP and we look at the purposes of this, it supports allowing that variance. And there aren't significant, the counterweight here is that there are not, the impacts of the density variance are not significant on, you have an undue influence on the neighboring properties. Given that, as Mr. Hildebrand has spoken about, you could do 4 fourplexes with ADUs, which would actually take you to a higher density per hectare, but would be allowed under the land use bylaw. So it's not the common amenity housing and the increase in density with this development that is going to have significant or undue effects on neighboring properties. When we look at the purpose of it, it's perfectly in alignment with the board should exercise its power as the CPC did to allow that variance. But I'm happy to comment on the use piece a little bit more. I just want to pull that paragraph so I can comment on it a little bit more, and I'll comment in my reply.
Thank you. It's paragraph 38. I have it in front of me. The final 2 sentences states, second, the appeal board must also be satisfied that the proposed development conforms with the use for the land or the building in the bylaw. This condition in 6873D sub 2 is referred to as the use condition. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that part of that second question of 687 and the test as to whether or not we can exercise our discretion in the circumstances.
Yes, so I can comment on that. My apologies, I don't. So in terms of the use element, obviously you can only exercise the variance power if the use is provided for. So for example, if a use isn't listed in a zone, if you wanted to put an industrial factory into a residential zone, you couldn't use the variance power to do that, which makes sense because that's why we have permitted and discretionary uses. And my comment on, I would submit that this does meet the use tests for both townhouses and common amenity housing. I think that the development planner has spoken extensively. I think we need to read these bylaws in a purposive manner as is kind of consistent with statutory interpretation throughout. And I'd note that no one has raised an issue of whether or not the use is actually met here. So that isn't an issue that the appellants have raised in this case. But in respect of the common amenity piece first, there's the question of whether or not the bathrooms result in it not being common amenity housing. The development planner submitted that doesn't knock it out. We see shared, we look at it contextually and we see shared living spaces, shared kitchen facilities, shared laundry facilities. And as Mr. Hildebrand has spoken to, arguably if you have 2 people per room, you do have a shared bathroom facility in that case. So I would submit that this does fall within the definition of common amenity housing, read proposively as it's added to the land use bylaw. In respect of the townhomes piece, the townhomes identifies that there's 3 or more dwelling units per building. And the common amenity housing is being counted as a dwelling unit for the purposes of density calculations. Because if it wasn't, we wouldn't need a variance for that. So there is in fact more than 3 dwelling units per building in this development. So it meets the definition of townhomes. It's not that so those are actually within the definition of townhomes as defined in the Kenmore land use bylaw. So from the use test, there's no variance or any sort of change happening with the use element. Both of the proposed uses are listed as either permitted or discretionary within the zone.
Thank you for your comments on the use condition. Appreciate that, Ms. Hutton-Lake. Mr. Bell, Mr. Scott, any further questions? Thank you. Now like to ask any persons present speaking in opposition to the appeal to please identify themselves.
Yes, Madam Chair, I misspoke earlier. So Frank Kernick had registered to speak in opposition of the subject appeal, but he's currently not here. So we can continue on with the agenda.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Have any persons identified themselves, Ms. Bravo Stewart, as speaking neither in favor nor opposition to the appeal?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There was one, but it was Joey Young, but he informed us that he's changed his, that he was in support of the subject appeal. So there's no others that are speaking in neutral of the subject appeal.
Thank you, Ms. Bravo Stewart. In connection with that, have you received any further correspondence in opposition or neutral since the agenda package was circulated?
Madam Chair, so there were 6 letters of opposition to the subject appeal that was received and placed in the agenda package for the April 21st hearing. And then at that hearing as well, we received a late submission, which was accepted as new information. So in total, there are 7 letters of opposition in the subject appeal, which has been consolidated into the SDAB package that was circulated for today's hearing.
Thank you.
And then to clarify, there was one letter from Joey and Joanna Young that was neutral of the subject appeal. But they would need to confirm if that letter is now going to be changed to in support or if it can remain neutral.
Is Mr. Young still on the call?
I believe so. Joey, are you available?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you confirm if you would like your letter of non-support, neither support, no, non-support to remain in the neutral category, or would you like your comments today in support of the appeal to trump?
I think the comments today will trump that letter. The information in that letter was written on that day as a neutral tone in terms of what was known and was going forth in front of the board. So is there going to be an opportunity to ask another question?
I will provide another opportunity, yes.
Thank you, because I didn't want to go over a lot of the existing questions. I do have a question just in terms of the townhome and variances that wasn't addressed, because I guess the argument that we're not against any of the variances is
just point of order, Madam Chair. I believe we'll have to wait until the rebuttal at the end. And I believe we can provide an opportunity at that time, just so that we can continue with the proper process as
Right.
outlined.
Right, yeah.
I agree. Mr. Young, if it's okay, we will give you that opportunity after all closing remarks.
Okay, it's a question that hasn't been brought up.
Okay.
It's just in regards to the area structure plan, so, or the redevelopment plan.
I think, okay, in the circumstances, I'll allow the question, if you can keep it brief.
Yeah, the question was, so in the area redevelopment plan, under the page 9, building design, it says duplicate or very similar buildings shall not be allowed adjacent to one another. And so that's a question I have for under that provision. Are multiple townhouses or similar units in succession across 3 lots allowed under that, or is there a variance required to allow for that duplication?
Do you have a reference number so that the board can look at that in their
Yes,
deliberations?
it is page 9, section 4.111.
Thank you, Mr. Young. We'll take that into consideration.
Yes, thank you.
We now move on to closing remarks. I'd like to invite the appellant, Mr. Hennessy, to provide any closing remarks, comments, or clarifications.
Yes, I have a few remarks, Madam Chair. I just want to summarize some of the points I made earlier and also respond to some of the points made by the developer. I'd like to reiterate that at minimum 69 people, but upwards of 99 people might be living in the 4 buildings. The ARP zoning diagram clearly shows that First Avenue from Hospital Place to 15th Street is zoned as low to medium density. To many of the residents in TP Town, that implied that redevelopment in this quite small area would be family-oriented housing. That is some combination of duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhouses. I suggest that the proposed development violates the spirit of the ARP for First Avenue. I think it's also important to note that we are not arguing that staff housing is not currently available in TP Town. We are not commenting on the morality of the people living in the staff housing units. We are simply pointing out that this development will result in a very high density of people living in this development. The development is simply too large, housing too many people for the allotted space and for this neighborhood. Again, this is a first for Kenmore. I guess the pertinent question then is, would you want this test case in your neighborhood? It is also worth noting that all but one of the houses surrounding the development on First Avenue are or will be owner occupied. Houses 1401, 1407, 1411, and 1344. 3 of these are triplexes and one's a single family home. These are the homes surrounding the development on First Avenue. In terms of parking, we simply don't know how many vehicles will require parking. Nobody here knows that it's going to be 10 or 15 or 10 or 12. But as stated by Mr. Scott, the staff housing in the development is meant for older, more mature, longer term employees. In other words, those who've lived in the Bow Valley for a longer period of time. These are exactly the type of people who are going to own vehicles. Also, common sense suggests that 60 of these people would own more than 12 vehicles. Having said all this, I support the compromise where one of the 3 staff housing units would be replaced with the 2 townhouses. While not a perfect compromise from the appellant group's perspective, this is a position where each party compromised to reach an agreement. This could be summed up as don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. My final comment, the point made by Joey, I think the correct reference would be page 8 of the ARP, point 412, item 9. That is all the comments I have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy. Appreciate that. Mr. Bell, Mr. Scott, any further questions? Thank you. Now turn to the applicant, Mr. Hildebrand and his agents to make any final closing remarks, comments, or clarifications.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be very brief. In our submission today, we extensively talked about employee housing and why it's required and how it's developed in other neighborhoods. And that was really to address the written submissions of the appellants, who the tone of those submissions were that they did not want employee housing in the neighborhood. So that those really weren't reiterated by some of the appellants in their verbal comments today, but they were certainly came through loud and clear in the written submissions. With respect to parking, two comments. We're not experts. We have to rely on the experts. We had the same discussion with the CPC, and the members of that commission, I guess at the end of the day, kind of said to each other, we don't know what the parking requirements are, but we have to rely on the experts. And, like I said, a lot of time and energy and expense went into preparing that parking study. And the results are what they are. And I think you need to rely on them. And, as laymen, our opinions are our opinions, but they should carry significantly less weight. And my second comment around the employee housing is when employers buy these units or lease these units, they're going to know full well how many parking stalls are available. And if 2 parking stalls is not adequate, then they won't lease them or they won't buy them. And the market will dictate whether that's acceptable or not. And I'm not sure it's your job to second guess what the market wants. I would have loved to have more parking available for those units, but we were constrained, and 12 is the maximum we could get, and the parking study proved that was adequate. I take Mr. Scott's comments to heart, and if we can squeeze 1 or 2 more stalls in, we're all for it, but that's not our call. That would require some further discussions with the town, and to give up some green space for pavement. I hope those comments are helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Mr. Scott, any questions? Please proceed, Mr. Bell.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Hildebrand, I have a question, but it's on the compromise proposal, which we haven't talked about very much, but and it relates to bicycle parking, and it's just a question of clarification. In the Schedule A, in the summary chart that you and the appellant had prepared, it said that there would be a total of 35 stalls plus lockers. And then condition 4 says there'll be a total of 30 stalls, and condition 13 shows a total of 45 stalls and lockers. So I didn't know what was the right number, unless I'm just not reading it correctly.
You're reading it correctly, but it was a mistake. It was a typo.
Okay.
Essentially, the number of bike parking stalls would be cut in half plus 2. So if we only had 3 common amenity housing units, the parking provided for 3 versus 6 would be cut in half, and then we would add 2 bicycle parking stalls that are required for the townhouse, which is requirement for people visiting the townhomes to park their bikes.
So both the temporary and the permanent would be cut in half for the common amenity.
Correct. So if we only had 3 units, we would have 10 indoor stalls, and the outdoor stalls would be cut in half.
Okay.
That's 2. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a typo. Apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Now invite representative of town administration to provide any closing remarks, comments, or clarifications. Mr. Weldon, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I get into my closing remarks, I have a couple points of clarity. And I also have a follow-up on the questions that were asked previously during my presentation.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you. So just for a note of clarity, I know Mr. Hildebrand had mentioned an employee housing development on Bow Valley Trail at 500 Bow Valley Trail. I just wanted to provide a bit of clarification there for the board's consideration, is that this was a council approving amendments to the applicable area redevelopment plan for that area and the land use bylaw to allow for the consideration of the common amenity housing at that location. So it's just a minor clarification. It's not that the development was approved, so it's not going to be constructed. It still has to go through a development permit process, but rather council approved the amendments to the policy document and the land use bylaw that would therefore allow for the consideration of the development. So it's just a minor clarification, but I thought I would just make that for the board. There was also a question regarding the availability of on-street parking on First Avenue in front of the townhomes. Mr. Hildebrand had outlined the town spacing requirements, which was correct. Given the spacing in front of the townhomes fronting onto First Avenue, one stall would be available from a public parking perspective on the street on First Avenue in front or on First Avenue in front of the property, and likely for an additional stall on the west side and the east side of the development, but that would be dependent on how the neighboring properties would develop in the location of their access onto First Avenue. So just another point for the board to consider there. Okay, so during my presentation, Madam Chair, you had brought up a question related to the proposed developments consistency with the townhouse use definition. And so I am going to read out the townhouse use definition and I will speak to it. So townhouse means a single building comprised of 3 or more dwelling units separated from each other by walls extending from foundation to roof, with each dwelling unit having a separate direct at-grade entrance. This includes all row linked patio, garden, court, or other housing which meet this criteria. A townhouse development may consist of a group of buildings, each of which contain 3 or more dwelling units. Okay. So I'm going to break this down a little bit, and I'm going to, I think, anticipate what your concern is with this definition and the conformance of this definition, or the conformance of the proposed development. So as was noted earlier, it is the townhouse is a single building comprised of 3 or more dwelling units. So 3 or more dwelling units that is consistent. 3 or more dwelling units do exist between the common amenity housing and the townhouse units. Now, these are separated from each other by walls extending from roof to foundation, or from foundation to roof rather. Now, this is where I think because of the this construction or this configuration of the requirement of having walls extending from foundation to roof, this might be where the challenge is given the proposed development and the configuration of the proposed development, in that each of the dwelling units of the common amenity housing does not have a wall extending from foundation to roof, and then each dwelling unit having a separate and direct at-grade entrance. Okay, So that is the concern with the townhouse use as it relates to the proposed development. Now, the land use bylaw in this zoning district also allows for townhouse stacked or stacked townhouses to be considered. It is listed as a permitted use within this district. So I will read that definition. This definition of townhouse stacked means a multiple unit dwelling comprised of 3 or more dwelling units and constructed such that 1 or more dwelling units are located totally or partially above another dwelling unit, and each having a separate direct entrance from grade or a landscaped area. Similar to townhouse, a townhouse stacked development may consist of a group of buildings, each of which contain 3 or more dwelling units. Now, I'm going to break this definition down as I did with the townhouse unit, and as it conforms to the proposed development. So firstly, stacked townhouse is a multiple unit dwelling comprised of 3 or more dwelling units. So what is proposed is that the building comprises, it is a multi-unit dwelling, and it does comprise of 3 or more dwelling units. Each common amenity housing unit is considered a dwelling unit in this case. Secondly, that it's constructed such that 1 or more dwelling units are located, and so 1 is the key here, or more dwelling units are located totally or partially above another dwelling units. So when you look at the proposal, 5 dwelling units are located in each building. 2 are located above another or above each other, while 1 is located at grade, and the other 2 are located directly adjacent to each other. So this portion of the land use is also met through the proposed development. And then lastly, each unit has a separate direct entrance from grade or a landscaped area. So this is also true. Each unit has an access directly from grade, 2 of which has direct access to grade via the internal staircase. So this provision of the land use for townhouse stacked is also met in this case. So the proposed development, I will say aligns more closely or is consistent with the townhouse stacked definition, as I've just explained, rather than the townhouse as the separate just townhouse land use. As I mentioned, both are permitted uses within this district. It's also, I'll just note that the definition for townhouse stacked was also again created to allow for the flexibility in the manner of built form for the different dwelling units for the different townhouses. And this is represented in this case through the common amenity housing built form, and therefore is consistent with the townhouse stacked land use definition. So I'll maybe just pause there, Madam Chair, if you have any questions before moving on to the second question that was raised by Mr. Bell.
No, that answers my question. I appreciate you pointing out the definition of townhouse stacked and that it is a permitted use.
Thank you. Okay, excuse me. Yeah. Okay, so Mr. Bell's question related to the provision of section 6.1 in the area redevelopment plan that states that increases to residential density is smallest within the core and generally replacing single detached dwellings with duplexes or fourplexes. So I think to start, it's important to understand the difference between the area redevelopment plan, which is a statutory planning document, and the land use bylaw, which is the regulatory land use and regulatory document that the town uses to implement the policies of the MDP and statutory documents like the area redevelopment plan. So area structure plans and area redevelopment plans, they provide a policy framework for the area. And as just mentioned, the land use bylaw, specifically through the provision of what's commonly known as zoning or land use districts, provide the regulatory or the development regulatory framework to implement the policies outlined within the statutory documents. So that it's a bit of a subtle difference, but it's the difference between providing a framework to work towards and a plan to be meeting within the future, and then using the implementation tool of the land use bylaw to realize those policies and those goals and objectives outlined in the policy document. So it's important to note, so as I mentioned, the section 6.1 does provide the direction to have the residential density be the smallest within the core area, and smallest being relative to the other areas that are identified within the area redevelopment plan. So that being the medium density residential district and the mixed use district. It's also important to know that the common amenity housing, just like this section says that replacing single detached dwellings with duplex and fourplex, generally the ARP also states that common amenity housing will be supported in this area too. And that's why you see this as a listed use in the district. Okay, so now, so using that policy framework and establishing this area as a low to medium density area, the land use bylaw outlines the maximum density for this area. So the maximum density for this TP Town area comprehensive redevelopment district subarea A, which corresponds with the low to medium density area of the area redevelopment plan, the maximum density of 66 units per hectare has been established. So what this means is it is establishing the range, taking that guidance from the area redevelopment plan, it's establishing the range of low to medium density. So by establishing this maximum, it means that when you think about this area, that each area or each parcel can be developed to this density of 66 units per hectare. The proposal is for 77.8 units per hectare. So this is over that 66 units per hectare. And this amounts to, based on the area of land, it equates to an addition of 3 units over the established maximum. So the Development Authority, through the land use bylaw, has the ability, and so too does the board, to consider variances to these regulations, so long as it does not unduly affect the use, enjoyment, and value of the neighboring properties. So this has already been stated of the reasons for the support of this increase in density. But the site is designed in a manner that provides for, as mentioned earlier, transition of units, with the lesser number of units being at the front of the site adjacent to First Avenue, which is more internal to the core area of this TP Town, transitioning to where the additional units will be at the rear of the site, and adjacent to the medium density area of TP Town, located to the north. Further, the common amenity housing units are also located interior to the site, and again to the rear, adjacent to the medium density district. So the density expected across the rear lane will not negatively impact the neighboring properties there. And although the density prescribed for this area, it is a low to medium, it is still within a reasonable range of density that is consistent with the intent of this area. So I will maybe pause there as well, because that concludes my my response to the question that was raised.
Mr. Bell, do you have any follow-up questions to that information?
No, thank you to Ms. Weldon for that summary.
Thank you, Mr. Weldon. I believe you said that you'd have some closing remarks.
Yes, I do. I know we've had it's a long time, so I'm not going to go over my presentation again. You have it. There's been a lot of information provided, and I think I will let the information be. However, I will like to say that, you know, common amenity housing, this is the first time this type of housing is being proposed, and it is important to provide the opportunity for these types of housings and configurations in the residential area. And the reasons why this is important to Canmore generally, but also I would state for the TP Town community, is that these applications for these types of housing, they do provide options for all people within the community. And it does ensure that the town's neighborhoods are inclusive and available to everyone. And it's also very important to provide this type of housing when you look at Canmore's housing needs and having an impact on Canmore's housing current housing situation. So I think I will leave it there. And again, yeah, I can answer any questions that the board may have.
Thank you, Mr. Weldon. Mr. Bell, Mr. Scott, any further questions for Mr. Weldon, any of town administration? Thank you. Do you have any questions for the appellant or the applicant coming out of all the summaries? I have one question for Mr. Hildebrand. Mr. Hildebrand, are you available?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Acknowledging the importance of the common amenity housing for Canmore, and for all the reasons provided by yourself and others on the call here today, I was wondering, and the difficulties that are apparent with the definition, despite the intent, is there any way to accommodate a shared cleaning, I think it's washing and sanitary facility in the units? Right now you have 6 units with 5 rooms, but each of the rooms have ensuite bathrooms. Is there any way to accommodate a shared facility to make this fit in the square lines of the definition?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the 2 of the bedrooms could have a Jack and Jill type bathroom. We could have 1 or 2 bathrooms that are shared by the 5 bedrooms to meet that sort of strict definition. As I tried to mention in my presentation, you know, if that was a concern and you made that a condition, you know, we could easily accommodate that. Those are all kind of interior to the space changes that could be made at the building permit stage. And so the answer is yes. My only comment would be, I think that would be a mistake. You know, we have done a lot of research and spent a lot of time speaking with employers, and you know, having private bathrooms per sleeping room is one of the key things we heard over and over again, that's what employers want and that's what the market wants. You know, the dorm style housing with a shared facility like we all had back in residence and university, you know, that works for new employees that are coming to the market and you know, coming to town for the summer to work and have some fun, but it doesn't fit for the more mature employees that we're trying to attract. And what employers are telling me is really the desperate need. You know, it's those employees that have been here for a couple of years, they're now supervisors, or they're moving on in their careers, and they can't afford you know, permanent housing or to buy housing, and that's really the need. So I hope those comments are some assistance.
I do appreciate and acknowledge the merit of those comments. One final question, would and I haven't seen the interior floor plans for those units, but is there any way to accommodate a half bath, which would get us within the definition? Mr. Hildebrand.
Yeah, with your indulgence, I'll just pull up a floor plan here because I think that's probably the best way that we can answer your question. I'll just try sharing my screen again. Can you see the floor plan?
Yes, we can, Dale. It's just a PDF, yeah?
Yeah.
It looks good.
Okay, so I think if the comment is that the washing facilities, Madam Chair, had to be common, and you were allowed a toilet and a sink within each room, but then you had another room that had shower or bathing facilities, that could probably accommodate it. It would probably need to go sort of in this area, and then the bedrooms would get smaller. I hope that sort of helps answer your question.
Thank you for pulling that up and giving us a better view of the floor plans. If you could provide that to Ms. Bravo Stewart, it would be appreciated.
Sorry, that is included in the agenda package.
It's already there. Okay, thank you.
Page 30 of 125.
Appreciate that clarification. Mr. Bell, Mr. Scott, any follow-up questions? I see a hand up for Ms. L. Hatton Lake. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just in response to your question, I think that Mr. Hildebrand's right. But you could also, if you've looked at those, you could certainly change a door orientation so that one of those units was accessible without having to enter a private bedroom. So those are all interior changes, which Arbors Mountain Homes is certainly open to considering. And those would be minor changes. A number of the bathrooms have walls which are adjacent to the kind of commoner areas.
Thank you for pointing that out as well. Any further comments, questions from anyone else on the call before I conclude the hearing? No, okay, thank you.
Sorry, Madam Chair.
Mr. Hill, go.
I was hoping that the development officer might be able to address Mr. Scott's question, or that one of the appellants asked about number 11, duplicate or similar buildings allowed adjacent to one another. That was certainly something that we took a lot of time and care and addressed in our design. And perhaps we can just.
Certainly, if someone from town administration, Mr. Weldon, is willing to comment on that and able, we'd be happy to hear those comments.
Sure, Madam Chair. So yes, this was considered and was looked at by administration when reviewing the application. Town administration was satisfied that this requirement in the land use bylaw was met. The development is being developed as a comprehensive site, and therefore the two buildings, although they are different, they are similar. But because they are part of one comprehensive development and site, we considered this requirement to be met. Now, if there were a separate lot that was proposing a similar style of development adjacent to this one, that is where administration would be looking for consider a different design than what would be considered similar to these. So I hope that helps provide some clarity on that.
Thank you, Mr. Weldon. Mr. Scott, does that address your question? I'll take that as a
what I've got, Mr. Weldon. Sorry, Madam Chair. I did ask Mr. Hildebrand if there was any way that he could squeeze in any more parking stalls. And his comment was the only way that he could do it would be to effectively eliminate, I think, he said, some of the trees and so forth on the site. And I think he indicated that he was sort of at the minimum right now, and there was nothing he could really do unless he got a variance to change the landscaping.
Through the chair, yes, that is correct. The landscaping is near to the minimum required through the bylaw. Therefore, with the provision of an additional parking stall, it would take away from that landscaped area and would require a variance. So that is a correct statement. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you, Mr. Scott, for your question. Anything further? There being nothing, I'm going to proceed to concluding the hearing. Before concluding, I'd like to ask the appellant if he feels he's had a fair hearing here today. Mr. Hennessy?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much. And the applicant, Mr. Hildebrand, do you feel as though you've had a fair hearing here today?
Yes, thank you for all your consideration, Madam Chair and board members.
Thank you all for your participation and maintaining decorum. This hearing is now concluded. In accordance with provincial legislation, the board is required to hand down its decision within 15 days. No decision will be binding until the board has issued the written decision. Mrs. Bravo Stewart will be circulating the decision and posting it publicly once we have provided that to her. That concludes the public portion of our hearing. I move the board to adjourn today's May 31st, 2022 hearing. Those in favor? None opposed. Motion is carried unanimously. The public portion of today's hearing is adjourned.